Knockback, the retro and nostalgia podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Knockback. My name is Colin Moriarty. I'm joined as always by my brother Dagan, the Judge Moriarty. Dagan, wanted to pick out the absolute worst character for you in this book full of horrible characters. How are you doing today, my friend?
The city-sold rascal himself. Good. The evening redness in the east. That's us.
Yeah, it is.
That's us,
my
friend.
It is. Here it is, Blood Meridian.
Man, I've been looking forward to this.
I gotta say, I never saw this before. I buy a lot of books. I don't read too many books like I used to anymore, so I maybe this is more common now, but this is definitely not common back in the day. Is that it tells you the date that it was printed.
Oh, cool.
Have you seen that before? So it says made in USA, Middletown, Delaware, 16 June 2023.
Really?
Yeah.
Shout out to the Delawares.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll get into them.
Yeah, definitely. So I thought that was strange. So this book was like just hot off the presses. I read it. So I read it in like 5 bursts. It's, what is it? 350 or something like that. 350 pages. And yeah, I floated around the pool 3 times and read it over 3 days. And then I read it like in bed one morning. And then I read it last night, like the last 50 pages or something.
Wow.
So, and I have tons of notes as always. But we're here to talk about Blood Meridian in the name of Cormac McCarthy, R.I.P. Cormac McCarthy recently passed away. Famous, maybe the most famous American author ever, actually, which is kind of interesting. This book is actually I was reading a little bit about it, and I didn't realize that this book is so well respected that it you know, the entire argument of the great American novel. Like, what is the great American novel? The great American novels. That some people say this is the great American novel.
Yes.
Which I contend is maybe not true, but
I can't wait to do this.
Yeah, I'm so. Let's just get right into it. We don't even have to waste any more time, unless you have anything you want to say.
No, this is fun, man. I mean, you know what? Just before we begin, 2 things. It's interesting because you would think, and you may disagree with this, but you would think, knowing a little bit about this book going in, that this would be a pretty depressing book for 2 guys who tend to be a little depressed lately, right? But I don't find it that way. And number 2, I don't want to toot our horns, Kyle, but toot. Because what other show do you know, and you and I have talked about this, where you could go from the Mighty Ducks one week to Blood Meridian the next week? That range, no other internet show has that range.
I know, it's interesting.
It's amazing.
It's maybe a little bit strange, but yeah, it's probably the reason why the show never really got huge, but no one has any idea what we're going to do on any given time. By the way, I noticed you're drinking that Black Death. Tell me what more. I saw that on Pat McAfee for the first time.
Oh, Liquid Death?
Liquid Death. That's what it is. Liquid Death.
This is just canned water.
Yeah.
It's very fashionable with the podcasters.
Yeah, but why? Like, why is it?
I honestly think the whole thing is murder your thirst. And I think it is one of those ironic things. It's like Liquid Death. It's like something that you ingest. It's the complete irony of marketing, right? A marketing strategy. Very expensive. It's like $20 for a 12-pack. I saw, you know what happened? Charlie, my father-in-law, saw them on sale, saw cases on sale for $8 and just kind of knew in passing, that's a really expensive item. I'm just going to get it. And he bought like 5 cases of it.
Nice. Good for him.
Just because it was $8.
Because he knew it was with the kids. Smart.
That's what the kids are doing now, the Liquid Death.
That's good. Yeah, when I first saw that, I looked it up because I was like, I thought it was when I first saw it drinking it was like an energy drink or something.
And it could pass for a beer. I was drinking on the beach and I saw some people looking like, what's that dude? He's not even trying to conceal the container, that type of thing. It's good. I prefer, if you're a seltzer guy or a sparkling water guy, I still prefer Perrier, San Pellegrino, all that kind of stuff. It's also, those 2 things are also very expensive, but cheaper, a lot cheaper than Liquid Death. But it's good. It's fine. It's passable.
Yeah, I drink my Smart Water. Here.
Yeah, that's good.
And then I just fill it up 17 times with water before I throw it away for some reason. Oh yeah, hiding in Santa Monica. You know, I lived real close to the beaches. You know, I used to go to the beach all the time and just lay there and read and hang out. And I didn't give a fuck. I was like, I'm drinking on the beach. I don't know what you want. What do you think? What do you think I'm doing here? I don't know. Like, what am I? I used to smoke weed on the beach too. You know?
That's becoming more and more of an okay thing, apparently. So times are changing, my friend.
I don't know what you're supposed to do at the beach as an adult if you're not drinking. All right, Dig. Let's get into it here.
Jump.
Blood Meridian, or the Evening Redness in the West, novel by Cormac McCarthy, R.I.P. again, just recently passed. Great American author, primarily focused on the American Southwest, et cetera, et cetera. Book came out in 1985, the year after I was born. And as I understand it, this book didn't really take off. It kind of got more of a cult following over time and then became more appreciated later on. I don't actually know what the specific book was that made Cormac McCarthy really big. I think it's, was it the horses one?
Yeah, all the pretty horses. The whole Border trilogy, I think, is what put him on the map ultimately. And then everybody retroactively went back and said, this is modern day Hemingway. But I don't know why the Border trilogy, maybe because of the film, the Matt Damon and that whole thing kind of added to the, and at that, probably around the same time is when he started doing screenwriting, I think, too. So that might have worked in his favor as well. Little TV zest. You
had brought it up, that you wanted to do this. We did The Road a long time ago. And then we did, which is arguably my favorite novel. And then we did, which other Cormac McCarthy novel did we do?
We did No Country, right?
Oh yeah, No Country. That's what it is. Yeah. No Country for Old Men.
Yep.
It's just on my shelf out there. I was just looking at it. I don't know why I didn't remember that. And so we did that. And we did the movie and the book, I think, at the same time. Or maybe we did it back to back. I don't know. But so people can go listen to those as well. So I'm not familiar with his entire bibliography of books. So I went out and bought this. Actually, Micah, I said this a while ago, she bought me a Kindle, which is awesome. And I don't mind reading like whatever on that book, but I knew that there are certain books that I still want to buy and have. And so this was one of them. So I went on Amazon and bought it. It was $10. And so I floated around reading it in the pool. And actually, I'm going to straight up admit a couple of things about this book. And I'm curious. I want to admit this because some people are probably gonna make fun of me, but I found this book, it's really hard to follow. Like, in my opinion, like I didn't always know exactly what was happening, to the point where I would read it. Sometimes I'd read a chapter again. And then I found this awesome website. It reminded me of being in high school when I used to cheat sometimes. They have like these websites where it's like just the chapter like synopses or whatever. And they're probably like 1,000 words each or whatever. So what I would do is I would read a few chapters and then I'd go read the chapter synopsises on this website and be like, oh, like there were certain things that I just didn't understand, especially with dialogue or who was who. Characters started kind of blurring together for me. I don't know if this is a common thing. And I think, so I appreciated that. And I was able to kind of figure out the things that I was missing, but I don't think I had to do that, but I think it helped my enjoyment of the book a little bit.
Yeah.
Here's what I'll say about Cormac McCarthy. And I reading 3 of his books and kind of, I think they're very different from each other, actually. I mean, they're all written in that same Cormac McCarthy. Like, I don't follow the conventions of English writing thing, which is fine. I think that's interesting. I don't know. Again, I don't know how he got away with that. Knowing especially that he got away with that before obviously he was not always famous. When you look at a book like this, you're like, how the fuck did this get printed by Random House?
Yeah.
Or published, but of all places, just because I think that unlike, so The Road, I think, is very easy to read. I think part of the reason The Road is so easy to read is because there's no one in it, right? There's like literally 2 characters, and sometimes you meet another person or whatever. And then I think No Country was not as easy to read, but easier to read and understand because there are fewer characters and more of this kinetic. There's like a beginning, middle, and end.
Yes.
To that, like there's a story there.
Yep.
I actually think Blood Meridian, there's like no story. Like it doesn't really seem to serve a purpose, including right up to its Sopranos-like ending, and so it's really, and then that's when I enjoyed reading some things about it afterwards or whatever, about how, like, I didn't know that Glanton dude was real. I don't know very much about the Mexican. I know a little bit I know more than the average bear, I guess, about the Mexican-American War, the Mexican Cession, Treaty de Guadalupe or whatever that was, Hidalgo Guadalupe or whatever the hell that troop, and the filibusters and the Texas Revolution and all that. I know those things, but that's kind of a soft spot in my American history knowledge. So I've actually always found it quite boring. So I like, just, it's like the desert. It's like, who gives a shit?
Yeah.
Like I always felt that way when people were like, I love cowboys. And I'm like, why?
I know you felt that way about cowboys.
Yeah. I'm like, I'm like, it's cool. Everyone talks in this book like I talk in my Southern man voice, and I kept doing it in my head, which is awesome. And I loved all of that, but it just never really, the cowboys and Indian shit, I was just like, I don't care. I like colonial America, World War II, the Civil War, stuff like that. Like that's just another world to me. So it was cool getting to learn more about that stuff and how truly violent and horrible things were out there. But I think and I'll throw it over to you, obviously, to hear what you have to say. I think that it was an interesting read. I think it's a great story and an interesting idea, but you kind of have to go into this book, I think, realizing in my personal opinion, I have no idea what the fuck he's even talking about sometimes. Like I'm just being like, I read things, like a paragraph over and over again. And I'm like, I don't even really know what you're saying. I think that like the use of adjectives and so it's like, come on, man. It's like getting out of control the way you describe things. And you realize, and this is kind of the frustrating thing with me with this book, as much as well written as it is, it's like, I'm like, there's no economy here. Like a lot of the stuff doesn't need to be said at all, And so I feel like I'm sounding more negative than I am on it, but it's my least favorite, actually, of the 3 books that we've done of his so far.
That's interesting.
But I do think that it's about, I think it's an allegory, obviously, for human nature. And I think that it's interesting from that perspective I think there's something fascinating about forcing people to confront the violence around them or the violence that made the world around them or the ability to be violent and set things to the wind. So I don't know. That's kind of what I have to say at the top, but I'm curious what you think of the Blood Meridian or the Evening Redness in the West.
Yeah, I mean, I'm enamored with this book. I mean, just if you are an LSM stan and you listen to the shows, you've heard me mention this book on KnockBack, on Constellation, possibly on Punching Up in passing. Recently, we discussed with Ben on Constellation our favorite books. I mentioned it. For me, Kyle, Blood Meridian, what brings me to Blood Meridian, there's a lot to say in this conversation, but what brings me is the writing. As a writer or as a would-be writer and just my appreciation for the writing, that's really the meat of it for me. But it's interesting everything you've said because it's very typical, I think, of the overarching conversation around this book. Some people say this replaces Faulkner and Hemingway as, their works, their masterworks, Melville as the great American novel.
Yeah, I don't think so. This is
it's interesting.
Yeah.
Some like 50%, like people come down the middle. I'm talking the layman like you and I and Harvard and Yale professors, Cambridge professors. It seems like right down the middle, very polarizing. And I think that's an interesting part of the conversation. And what brought me to Blood Meridian, what brought me to Cormac McCarthy, however many years ago, let's say the better part of a decade ago, was his writing. And in reading the Border trilogy, I'm especially fond of The Crossing and Cities of the Plain and the way the 2 main characters are interwoven through the 3 novels. And I think after that, we had already been familiar with No Country and The Road and the newer things. And I loved them. And I loved the film adaptations. That didn't hurt. And then I went back and read some of his older stuff. I think I read Outer Dark and then Child of God. Typically very dark, very morose books, challenging on that level, could be depressing, and very bold in what the subject matter, kind of fearless in a way. And then what really with Blood Meridian, I had never heard of it. I literally went to the library. This is probably about 5 years ago. And just said, I'm going to look for another Cormac McCarthy book. I think I was fresh off Child of God. And I saw Blood Meridian on the shelf with McCarthy's name on the binding. And I was like, what is this? And I picked it up and I flipped it around and I read the back of the jacket and I was already hooked for some reason. I brought it home. I read it through the first time. I think I read through the entire novel now twice, but also I've listened to the audiobook countless times, let's say 3 or 4 times. Plus read literature panels and lectures on the book and read a lot of things. So I have a lot of texture. So everything you said about reading it through once and finding it confusing and challenging and a little enigmatic and maybe a little feeling like it's jumping around and unclear and stuff, I could totally get. So I'm much more conditioned with the book. And I think all of those other extracurricular things that I've done really definitely help me. There's not a lot I think one could ascertain on their own. You can't get everything from the book just by reading it. I think it's a little too strange. And the other thing is too, I don't want to sound like a literature snob at all, but I'll go in for a Star Wars novel, new and old, the Harry Potter series, the Hunger Games, whatever. I'm down for just reading. But when it comes to McCarthy, what brings me to the fold every time is his writing. There's something so special about his writing. It's ethereal. And what Blood Meridian specifically, and I've said this to you before, but I'll say it to the audience now. It feels like, to me, knowing it as well as I do, I still read it or even listen to the audiobook. And there's passages that I feel like are so inspired that I feel like the author was out of body, like only somebody at the pinnacle of their game could have possibly written something like that. Whether it's something, sometimes he writes things that are so descriptive, and sometimes he'll make you laugh with something that's horrible. There's something so special about the writing of this book. And, you know, when you hear about Blood Meridian, you hear about the violence, you hear about the graphic nature of it. It's disturbing. And it is all of that. But what's interesting to me is it almost seems like McCarthy was putting all that in there to say the writing is even good at the actual writing, the lyrical and poetic nature sometimes of the writing, and sometimes stark and barren and almost lazy and spare and simple writing, and the rhythm back and forth. That's going to elevate it even above the story that I'm telling you and the violence and the atrocities committed and it's based on real life and so on and so forth, that I'm going to even put the writing above all that. So you could write something and make it beautiful and make the prose really lovely. But the fact that the writing for me is elevated even above these compelling characters and the compelling nature of the violence is really what is special to me. I've never read anything like it. I mean, and also the fact that McCarthy was sort of a return to the American Gothic novel, Southern Gothic with Faulkner or Hemingway, or somebody who was about what that whole movement that was about the writing. It wasn't about just the world building or the characters or the ideas or the plots. It's not Agatha Christie. It's something about building the foundation out of that classical writing ability. That is like so, the writing in this book is so powerful to me. And the other thing is too, Kyle, I read recently that he started this book maybe in the mid 70s. So it took him the better part of a decade to 12 years to actually write and release this book. And apparently would write it in really inspired sort of frenzies and then leave it on the shelf for 6 months and then come back. And the book oddly feels like that. It feels a little disjointed, but for some reason that works with the story he's telling for me. Maybe he just got lucky.
There is something about like his syntax and the way he just writes like someone with complete authority over the subject matter, over who obviously his own characters are, but also over the language. Because, dude, reading this is a labor. Like I would be, I feel like you kind of come off a little bit of as an asshole if you read this and be like, oh, it was no problem. Are you fucking kidding? Like the more I read it, the more I'm like, wow, this is a really deeply complex book. I was even trying to pay attention just in my mind. I wasn't taking notes as I was reading because I just feel like that's kind of lame. And I was going to start circling like passages that I thought were really good until I found out that there's like one every other page. That's like insanely well written. But I think that, and I think that that's like, you and I are both writers, right? And I think that from that perspective, that really impresses me because I am not a prolific writer. I write a little bit and then it's like we joke about it all the time. It's like writers don't write. Like that's the joke is that, oh, writers don't write, you know? That's a very rare thing for us to do. But there are people that are, you know, like Stephen King, obviously, that are more prolific. And I know he was a big fan of Cormac McCarthy, and Cormac McCarthy not nearly as prolific in terms of volume of work, but I guess I'm just impressive with the command of language. These are a lot of these words, especially the adjectives, but verbs too, are not so much nouns, I guess, although I guess maybe a little bit, but certainly adjectives and verbs are things and ways to say things that I either have no idea what you're talking about, or I'm like, wow, I never thought to think that way. And where does all of this illumination come from in your mind to so vividly describe something in a way that I immediately understand? There was something he said, there's some line I remember about it was like the purple light that you would see in a cemetery or something like that. And I'm like, yeah, right. Like there's weird, I just never, it really does, at least from my perspective, emasculate me completely as a writer, where I'm like, Jesus Christ, like there are people that do this at such a high level that it's embarrassing that you even call yourself a writer.
See, that's what I think.
And that this is certainly one of those things. I just don't know that he benefits all the way from the obtuse vocabulary, the chippiness with rules of syntax, using quotations and commas. And it's like, I don't know. Think about it this way. XYZ, in quotes, said Glanton, right? ABC, retorted the kid. Another quote. Like, does that really hurt it by like just letting you know who's saying things? I think it's like a little too prideful in some way. Like the writing is so offbeat that no one would be able to write like this. Like
it's very offbeat. He says it with clarity, but like no one else you've ever heard or read would say it. Very unique voice. And also maybe you're starting me the one of the things I was looking forward to with this conversation with you was that it's going to make me think things. As much as I think about this book and have thought about this book, this conversation with you is going to make me think things that I never thought of before. Not only a little bit of historical context that you could bring that I certainly can't, but also your sort of instincts as a writer too. And a different type of writer, and a more talented writer than I am, actually, personally, I think. But yeah, you know what? And the thing is he so talented of a writer that it actually hurts him? Or can he be lazy for 50% of his effort and then come in strong and punctuate it with those moments of, it doesn't matter if there's sort of weak tethers between those really, really powerful sections of the book. I heard that he wrote the one section, you'll remember, Kyle, where the judge is talking to the Glanton gang around the campfire about war. That war is God, that whole war is God speech, that he sat down and wrote that in one sitting without even, like no punctuation, like just flew out of his hand, completely inspired. God
That's the one where he says the priest proves that war is the answer, right?
Yeah, it's basically Tobin and the judge arguing about it.
Right, and he says like your very appearance here is proof that that war is nature and war wins.
Yeah, war waited for man to come. Basically, war is everything, and it always has been, and there's not going to be any other thing, And later on, I could read that passage to you guys, and then there are parts in between that seem to meander and build to those moments where you say out loud to yourself, holy shit, as a writer. Like I would say out loud to myself, even listening to the audiobook sometimes, I'd be like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, who writes that? It's insanity. Like it's purely like the power of God coming through your hand to the page. I don't think, as much as I've appreciated specific works of fiction, like my gold standard in the old days, dating all the way back to high school, was probably The Sound and the Fury. I had never been so moved by the writing of a story as that. And then Hemingway and Salinger's Franny and Zoe, I always loved as something with character and conversation. But this book, even compared to other Cormac McCarthy, is just on another level for me that is almost supernatural. And that's why it's so interesting for me to hear writers echo my sentiments, but also say, I don't really understand. And then, I want to understand, but I don't understand. And it's so, I mean, and this is the other thing, Kyle, going back for a second, this is one of those topics for me that is almost scary to enter into because I have it so high on a pedestal for myself that I'm not even sure what level of conversation could do it justice. And also, I'll tell you guys that are listening right now, if you're into reading at all and you appreciate good writing or just interesting writing or just want to be a part of this conversation, because a lot of people do consider this the greatest American book ever written, read it first, because I think part of the joy of this book, as challenging as it is on a lot of levels, is encountering some of that writing for the first time. And there's parts of this book that could almost take your breath away with the way things are written. It's an unbelievable experience, and you get more of it. It's one of those things that doesn't get distilled over time or with repetition. It only gets stronger, which is another weird thing for me, where I get more out of it every time I hear specific sections of the book. Which, how many books can you name like that? Where it's almost worth going in because you know it's going to be a journey on it. Your journey is going to get elevated with each time, with each repeated reading. Or, yeah, again, I would even recommend the audiobook. The Richard Poe narrated audiobook is very strong. He really does McCarthy's writing justice. Very, very. It's just really beautiful. And you're right, though, too, Kyle. There's a lot of weird things that I feel like McCarthy could get away with. Repetition. Sometimes you're like, really? It gets repetitive. The run-on sentences, the lack of punctuation, which I know bothers a lot of people, the almost amateurish use of simile. I mean, there's simile in every other sentence sometimes. And sometimes they're they're interesting, and sometimes they're really powerful, and sometimes they're a little childish. And there's a rhythm to it. And sometimes he'll run on and be very wordy, and then he'll punctuate that wordy paragraph with a 2-word sentence. It's I think rhythm is one of those things.
Excuse me.
That was sneezing. Sorry. I think the rhythm is one of those things that maybe the first or second time I read it, where I was like, you know what? This is a book where he almost realizes that he's going off and he's being very flowery, and then he reels it back in with a 2 or 3-word sentence, and then he starts over again. And there's something very intentional about that, and very poetic. I guess a lot of this reads like a poem that doesn't rhyme, if that makes sense.
Well, isn't like just the idea of novelization kind of interesting in and of itself? Like I was thinking about this recently in terms of language, because it came up during a conversation about AI and how these AI services and Google and all these guys are scraping the internet for art and writing and teaching their AI the rules through other people's work. And I was drawing a contrast between that and the chess engines. I forget the name of them, that are basically like unbeatable chess engines now. And the way that they got, and I promise I'm going somewhere with this, the way that they got the chess engine to work at such a high level was that they never taught it how to play. They only taught it the rules. So like, you can do this, and then it just would have it play a computer and play itself over and over again, and it learned rules. So it knew that you could theoretically do all these different things, but it only learned how to play chess at a high level by teaching itself how to play chess.
That's amazing.
And so it plays chess in a way that no one plays, right? Because it's approaching, everyone has taught everyone else how to play chess. And if you teach people just the rules, they might come out with a different outcome. And this outcome plays at like an order of magnitude higher than a human can play. It will never be beaten, right? It can just figure it out. And I say that because language, in terms of this AI scraping, is a similar thing. I was saying to someone recently and kind of challenging the notion of AI. I might have even been Jaffe on one of our shows, where I was saying the real challenge would be if you could teach AI somehow the syntax of language without using any specific examples, and then seeing what it actually came up with. In other words, how could you write in a way that is by rules theoretically sensible, but ways that you would never say anything. And that is this book.
Yeah, that's very well said.
It's taking none of it doesn't make sense technically, and none of it is technically goes against the grain of English language rules and all of that, except for punctuation, like we were saying. It's simply ways to say things that no one came up with. And it's as I was saying about the purple light and all these different things he talks about, and like you said, the constant similes and just comparing things to each other. You get that, and he writes in this book in that kind of post AI way, as if you just taught someone the rules, but never showed them Faulkner, never showed them Moby Dick, and it kind of comes out similar to those books in some sense, but actually wildly different. And I don't know if that resonates, but that's kind of the way I feel like this book reads. It's as if no one's ever really written something like this before.
Not that I know of.
Like all of my art, in other words, is inspired. I shouldn't say like my writing is inspired by other writing.
Sure. And
the new RPG we're working on is heavily inspired by a bunch of things. Harbroxia and all of that is inspired by my love of sci-fi. And so, but he wrote as if he just knew the words, but had no inspiration, I guess is what I'm saying. Like the inspiration was, I'm going to do something totally different and new. And I don't know where that comes from. I don't know if it's because he writes on his little fucking typewriter. I don't know if it's because he's straight edge and just has this ability, which is really interesting. I didn't know that about him, that I would have assumed that he was a heavy drinker, but he doesn't drink at all or didn't drink at all. And so I wonder if he was just able to kind of absorb himself into this whole new way of expressing English in a way that is both recognizable and totally novel. I've never personally, not that I'm like the most well-read person in the world, but I'm pretty well-read. And I've never read anything like this before. I mean, it almost feels like you're reading, it's not the same, but it's like reading late Middle English or early modern English, in just the sense that you're not entirely sure you're getting it because it's not the way people talk anymore. And I think I told you about this awesome thing on YouTube. I'll have to send it to you if I didn't. This guy did a project where he wrote, I don't know, a couple of minutes of just whatever, a fake conversation that a grandfather would be having with his grandson, but over many generations in England. So you can hear how English sounds every 60 years or something like that. And you do realize that at some point, probably in the 1500s, you're like, I get it now. And they're still like using weird things, but it's like you can hear it. You totally get it. And then by the 1700s, it's totally recognizable. He's in some sort of mysterious land with the language. And I think that that's pretty powerful, especially because he did it in the 80s where there were no, he's like a walking thesaurus. It's very interesting. Like he must have been very well read. I know he loved things like Ulysses and shit like that. I get that, but I don't know. I'm kind of going all over the place, but that's the way I feel about his style. It's just, it's a new way of writing. It doesn't seem to draw from anything, except for from at least that I'm familiar with. And I know most of the classics in some sense, I think. At least American ones. So anyway, does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. I agree. It's very original. He does something very different, and it is hard to articulate. I wish I could go back to the first time reading this because it's interesting. Although he could be elusive with his language, and he's obviously got a very large vocabulary to draw from, he repeats words throughout the novel. And I know his books well enough to know that he's very fond of words throughout his writing, not just this book. He uses the word shimmering a lot. He uses the word clanking a lot. He has those verbs and those adjectives and even those nouns that he sort of favors. And even though he's got that internal thesaurus at his disposal, he still has a very specific style based on the language that he chooses. And a lot of people say have a dictionary handy for this book. He uses the word bivouacked.
Yeah,
he uses the word jakes.
Yeah. He does use that word like several times.
And I finally had to be like, I have to look up this word. I don't know what this means. But I think for me, and maybe this is just my instincts as a writer or somebody who really loves to read, is that for the most part, I got the drift. I wasn't sometimes getting it in full because sometimes not knowing the meaning of that word leaves some sort of void. But for the most part, I would say 90% of the time, I could still ascertain what he's saying. And I think I'm so compelled by the writing that I just want to get to that next bit that inspires me, that makes me want to put down my pen as a writer. And that was the joy of it for me. And the other thing I don't hear enough about McCarthy, and I would definitely recommend the book Suttree for this, because it's probably his most lighthearted or funniest book. Although it's not lighthearted at all. But
1979, I'm seeing this. Yeah, I've never even heard of this.
It's great. It's really it's a great story, and it's written with a very specific sort of tongue-in-cheek humor. But he has a very humorous way of describing something in this book that could be horrific. And it almost makes you laugh because of the creativity, but also just the choice in knowing some of these horrific circumstances, some of these really morbid, disturbing, graphical violence that's happening in the book. And the way he chooses to describe it sometimes it paints a very interesting parallel to what's actually happening. And I just think that unique flavor is why you pick up this book. A lot of people are going to pick up this book because, okay, it's based on real life stuff, however loosely, savagery, beheadings, scalpings, killing and babies, raping children. Like this book has many triggers, right?
I think that one of the interpretations of the end of the book is that the kid himself is raped.
Yeah. The main character is graphically. Yeah. Everything you see happening to the innocents along the way happens to him, the protagonist, which is a crazy way to end.
I must say, I did not interpret it like that before when I was. No, I thought it just meant he was being killed, like he was dying, but I didn't get the rape part of it. I don't think.
Yeah. But the judge will get into him. I mean, he's a serial rapist. It's happening throughout the book. And while he's accusing other people of being that thing, such an interest. And that's the other thing that you come for is maybe the most, I won't say the scariest necessarily. In some ways, I think he is. But the most interesting eventual antagonist that I've ever read in fiction, because he's not the mustache twirling, outwardly malevolent dude tying the damsel to the railroad tracks. He's a master manipulator and somebody who's seemingly supernatural, all powerful, mystical, whatever. Is he supposed to be Satan? Is he some sort of demon? Is he an actual man? Is he some sort of hybrid? No one really knows.
Yeah, I mean, what do you make of the whole fable about him being found on the rock? Does that indicate that he is supernatural in some way? I mean, I didn't really understand. Like, are you earnestly telling me that you just found this dude in the middle of the desert, and he had they said he had no water.
Yeah, no water.
He was just hanging out, and then he teaches him how to make. Is that the same thing where he teaches them how to make powder?
Yeah, gunpowder.
Yeah, and
out of brimstone and sulfur.
Was that supposed to be some supernaturalistic thing, or was that just supposed to be? Because I know in reading a little bit about the illusions or what people glean from the illusions in the book, that it could be something to do with literal God versus devil, evil, for good versus evil, demonic stuff. I must say I never got that vibe that there was anything other than this dude just being absolutely insane. But I don't know if it was. But I don't know if it was supposed to be. It does come off a little campy almost. He almost comes off like a Batman villain, right? if you look at it through that lens, right? It's like
that's an interesting take.
But in the end, he is obviously this horrible and violent person. It makes me wonder. I know that they've tried to get a movie off the ground for many years, and they are.
Yeah,
it's licensed again, or optioned again. So we'll see if they do it this time. But I wonder who would play the judge, because it's such a fucking crazy character. I'm not even sure if you could even show half the things he does in the book. He throws dogs off of bridges. He takes kids and smashes them against rocks. He rapes little girls. It's who's going to play this character?
He's a vile villain.
And it's how are you? And at the same time, he's he's a very well learned. He's a polyglot and speaks 7 languages and has this journal. Oh, everyone around him is almost illiterate. The kid himself is illiterate.
Yeah.
But he's keeping all of these notes, and he's a master draftsman with drawing animals and leaves. And It's fucking weird. Like, I don't know what that's all about. But who do you think? Do you think who would even play someone like that? It must be maybe someone new. I just feel like you don't want to get too carried away with it. I mean, there's horrible people in fiction, but it's like, do you really want to associate yourself with that kind of character? It's not like Darth Vader or something like that. He would
almost be impossible to cast. A lot of people have said, which makes sense if you go back 40 or 50-year-old ago, Marlon Brando might have been. And I think a lot of people are thinking of Apocalypse Now, Marlon Brando, which makes sense.
That's a similar, Heart of Darkness is very similar to this book in that way.
Absolutely.
I mean, Heart of Darkness is much more clear.
Yeah.
Maybe we can do that book sometime too, but yeah, there's a connection there between Apocalypse Now, this book, and Heart of Darkness. Yeah.
That's a great point, Kyle. Yeah, it's sort of Heart of Darkness meets Batman meets Dante's Inferno meets a Western.
That's interesting.
Some sort of cowboy vehicle. It is really interesting. I think the judge, physically, how do you cast that, right? He's supposed to be like this 250-pound hulking, immense, super, like as white as the driven snow, right? Bald, completely hairless, like no indication of facial hair, eyebrows, no eyelashes, like almost small. They refer to him constantly as having small hands and small feet, despite his imposing size.
What about Jesse Plemons? You know that guy?
That would be interesting. Yeah, I could see that. I could. Yeah. The thing that is about the judge, and they say at some point towards the end of the novel that it doesn't seem like he's aged, but I don't know what age to cast him at.
Yeah, because they meet each other. It's like 30 years later or something, isn't it?
Yeah, the kid's in his or the man at that point is in his mid-40s at the end of the book.
Right, so 25 years. Because it would have been 48, 49, 50, and then it's like well after the Civil War. I think they said 78 or something, right? Something like that.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's all fucked up. I don't know. Yeah, I wanted to just ask you that because I'm like, I have no idea. I couldn't really see him. I couldn't. For some reason, and because it's not really accurate because they don't really describe him as this, but I just saw like a big dude in a duster for some reason. I have no idea why I saw it like that in my mind. Because that's like not what they have. These certain scenes where they say like he's just naked underneath like a flowing. Multiple times he's naked in the book, and he's like just got like some sort of weird shit on. By the way, before I forget to say it, that's one of the fucking coolest parts of the book, in my opinion, is when they meet some Indians and they're wearing conquistador like armor and shit like that, and I'm like, that's fucking awesome. That shit is so old. That shit's from like 200 plus years ago, and they're still wearing a lot of that stuff. And I loved one of the scenes where they had like one of them had a parasol.
Yeah, that's the same scene.
Yeah, it came off as Batman-esque in that, like crazy ass villains, like they're just doing whatever, wearing like some of them wearing like a dress and like one's wearing like a nice suit and shit. Like, this is fucking dope.
Bridal gowns and
you're right, exactly. The visual of it is amazing.
I wonder if the Comanche really did that kind of
shit. They probably did. Probably did. Because what I can understand, I think, about Cormac McCarthy, and I think why the writing is so impressive, is that it's so well researched. Like I said earlier, comes from a place of total authority, like PhD in Southwestern America. And so I think that shit is probably all pulled from random journals and encounters. That's what I loved about that show, Hell on Wheels, too. I think they were specifically dealing with the Sioux up there, but they were fucking crazy. I know it's like the I don't mean as insults, like the visual of the savage, like completely face painted, huge mohawks, like riding horses naked. I'm like, this is fucking dope.
That's so cool.
Imagine seeing that though when you're a white settler, or what, just it doesn't matter. I mean, you're going to be probably white as white settler, and you see something like out of hell, basically, that you've never seen in your entire life. I love that vision. Hell on Wheels, horrible name for the show, but did a really nice job of showing like the horrors of Indian combat, on the frontier. That was more in the North.
And that was the point, right? To terrify their enemies.
Definitely. I mean,
from a visual standpoint, by the time you get to them, they're going to be so terrified they can't even wield their weapons.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's the whole, that Comanche attack is such a visceral, I know everybody talks about that scene as being so violent and so difficult to read, but God, the way that's written with such clarity and such authority, not just on the historical context and hiding behind the cattle drove until they get into sight where they think there's maybe a couple of Indians they're in for a little battle, and they reveal themselves behind this cattle drove of like hundreds of attacking Comanche, but they managed to hide behind their livestock. And then by the time they got close enough, it's an ambush, total ambush. Mm-hmm. And then they look absolutely terrifying. They're wearing human parts, and they have shields of mirror glass, so they blind their enemies. I mean, they're just
fucking dope.
It's so cool.
It's mega cool. Like the combat sounds horrifying. Like I have no idea what anyone was doing out in the Southwest at this time, especially at this time before the Civil War. Like that was real pioneering insanity. And I want to get into all of that as well. But talk to me a little bit about your interpretation of the kid. Born 1833 in Tennessee, loses mom in childbirth. I think dad is kind of just like a drunk teacher, and he's illiterate and stupid. He runs away at 14 years old. And then I think they immediately fast forward 2 years. So you assume, if I remember correctly in my notes here, you get to 1849. I think he runs away in 1847. And that's when he runs into he runs into the judge for the first time. And that scene is awesome. I'm curious what you think of the scene when he comes in. Reverend Green is giving a homily or whatever and a sermon, and the judge just comes in and tells him that he was fucking little kids and goats, and these people. He cuts a hole with his knife out of the tent, his tent to run away, and then he just says he made the entire thing up, and then everyone laughs. And everyone starts drinking or whatever. What did you think of that whole scene?
So chilling. And that's the first time we meet the judge. And the kid is an interesting character. Again, the structure of the novel is interesting because the kid is kind of our would-be protagonist / guide through the story, but he's by no means a hero. He's just as despicable as almost every other character. He has some redeeming qualities, I guess, as you get further on into the novel. And it seems to me maybe it's a little bit of the ex-priest Tobin, that character, and the judge. A lot of the story is those two characters sort of wrestling in a tug of war for the kid's soul, right? One's the angel on the shoulder, one's the devil on the shoulder. But it's interesting because none of the three characters you would say are really necessarily main characters. But a lot of the story we are seeing through the lens of this young teenage kid, the kid who's at first somebody who's out, basically an orphan, right? And then a filibuster, and then becomes a scalp hunter, and the way he's kind of pulled through the story by various characters. But he's an interesting character from the outset because McCarthy does a lot of this type of young, troubled teenage boy character. But this one's pretty dark because there's no family. You learn from the outset that he's basically rejected by his father his whole life. I don't know if the father blames him for the death of his mom, who died in childbirth, but the dad, from what little we know, is a learned man. He's a schoolmaster or a teacher of some kind, highly literate, a poet maybe, but refuses to even teach the kid how to read. We know the kid, by the time he leaves home and runs away, he's illiterate. So really grew up in a very hateful home life, a very hateful situation, possibly physically abused as well, certainly emotionally and mentally abused.
Don't they say that he finds a Bible later, but he can't read it? He just carries it with him.
It's so crazy, right? To have a highly literate parent, but that refuses to impart his knowledge to you, that the parent would hate you that much. So from the outset, it's interesting because we don't get to know the kid that well. He's a generally sort of a silent protagonist. He's almost like a Link. He doesn't really say very much, but you have sympathy almost from the outset because he's had a bad hand dealt, and he leaves Tennessee and he kind of becomes this workaday dude, laboring and then coming to his filibuster thing and then eventually getting recruited by the scalp hunters. But that first meeting with the judge is interesting because we meet him at this tent revival, right? This priest-like guy that is proselytizing, and here comes the judge and just makes up this whole story about this guy for no reason. And then this is very close to the beginning of the book, maybe an hour or two in. And this Reverend Green guy is very popular. He's got this whole community of people there. They seem to be into it. Here comes the judge, completely tears the whole thing apart, right? Sabotages the whole outing. Says this guy's a child rapist. He's a goat rapist. Everybody believes him. They basically chase this guy down and all but murder him, I guess. And then the judge just admits that he was making it up. And that whole offing, though, what's interesting is they set the tone for the judge. McCarthy doesn't leave it dubious. That Reverend Green character says that's Satan. Don't you see that is the devil himself? He says it right from the beginning. So
yeah, it's very interesting. I didn't think of that.
Right from the start, we're already thinking that about the judge. He's like, what is this enigmatic evil dude? He's not human. And then that human reaction of everybody he basically ruined a man, if not had him murdered. And then everybody's reaction in that town is just to laugh and buy the judge drinks. And that really sets the tone.
He's like, I ain't never seen that man in my life. Or something like that.
They're like, Judge, how'd you know? He's like, I've never seen that man in my life.
Yeah. It's like ridiculous.
It's good.
It's super ridiculous. Yeah. He's an interesting, the kid is interesting just because I don't know who he is. Like if this entire thing is like a biblical parable in some way, then is he the essence of human nature, or like the most common denominator in some sense? I try to wonder. For instance, there's that scene, I think it's where he's sweeping the bar.
Yeah.
Right. And he chooses the most violent outcome basically for that. And I wonder if that was just like, he always reduces to the wrong choice in some way. Even when he could kill the judge later, he doesn't do it. And when he meets the judge as the man later on, he makes just the wrong choices that keep him alive, but whittle him down to an army of one, basically. I have a hard time understanding. That's why I have a hard time understanding the whole point of the book. Like there is no hero, I guess, which is not unusual. Well, it is unusual, but it's not unheard of. But what is the purpose of this story? And yeah. I try to read it through the eyes of our perceived protagonist, but you don't really ever want him to do any. He often makes the wrong choice anyway, or the violent choice. But I wanted to ask you brought up filibustering and stuff. What do you think about the whole Western setting, mid 19th century, Texas Revolution, Mexico kind of forming, and California kind of coming to life? It's cool that they go to places like San Diego and Tucson and Arizona, but they're also deep in Mexico and Sonora and other places. It's interesting because filibustering doesn't happen anymore. And for people that don't know, we use the term filibuster now to indicate someone in the Senate specifically like talking for a long time. So there's like procedural rules so you can't pass a bill, and that's filibustering. But filibustering, what it used to mean was what you would describe today as PMCs going overseas to countries with no authorization from the country they're coming from in order to invade and take a piece of it. And this kind of happened with the Texas Revolution. I mean, this is, I don't want to get too nerdy. Manifest Destiny, right, is the idea, and people can read about it, Manifest Destiny, just go read about it if you want. But it was this very American idea from the founding and from the founders that we would expand westward to the Pacific Ocean and encompass all of it. And the Monroe Doctrine, which came from James Monroe when he was James Madison's Secretary of State, which we still live under today. The Monroe Doctrine is still in force to this day. And that's where the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that stuff comes from, indicates that no power, Western power, is allowed to do anything in the Western Hemisphere. And so like South America, North America, all of that's ours. Like, and you can have little colonies, and you can obviously tons of new countries form, but there was a vision, and it's played out in this book, although it's not really discussed explicitly, that we would subsume all of it from Canada all the way down to Tierra del Fuego or whatever, and so if you read about it in the 1850s specifically, you'll find that like there were private military companies basically going to Nicaragua, and Sonora, like we see in the book, and other places, inspired by what happened in Texas, basically saying like, we can just do it without authorization, make basically a little American station, and then say we want statehood. And that was the entire purpose. So
crazy.
So Cuba was another target of that. And Cuba was really a target of American colonialism right through the 20th into the 20th century. I mean, the Spanish-American War in 1898 and the USS Maine and all that had a lot to do with Cuba. So I just wanted to explain to people that's what filibustering was. And it was inspired by this idea that, like, go yonder west, son. Like, if you can do the work and the hard work and establish yourselves like the Texans did, then go have at it, I guess. And no one's going to stop you. And they would do it ostensibly like as scalp hunting was kind of a thing that was a Venn diagram with it, make a little bit of money, kill the enemy anyway that's going to be trying to stop you from taking their land, and so on and so forth. So it's just wild because that doesn't really happen. In fact, this kind of comes off like a fucking Metal Gear Solid game in a lot of different ways, just in the 19th century, just from that political perspective of it's complete lawlessness. You see it over and over again. There's that awesome scene towards the end where they take over the ferry for no reason, right? They just kill that doctor, or they fuck with that doctor and do all this sorts of horrible
for fun
shit
and profit.
Yeah, exactly. And they, you see that they talk about a general of the U.S. Army on like an expedition simply refuses to deal with them and goes and builds their own ferry. So it's not like they tried to dismantle or confront them. They were just like, fuck it. And they just went around and went about their business. And the people that they worked with were then killed because the Indians cooperated with them to make the thing, I guess, were killed.
Right.
And his body was floated up the river past the Indian encampment to warn them. So I just love that over and over again. Like the Mexican armies in that, they get fucking destroyed in that one town where they have the howitzer, I guess.
Yeah.
And they talk about it. He writes this beautiful language about how they're in these gorgeous vestments and everything, and they just get fucking mowed down. There's no law or order out there. It really was a fucking free-for-all. And you see that because over and over again, they encounter abandoned village, abandoned town, half abandoned village, fucking remnants of a village, burned out hulls of wagons. And it's fucking crazy. So they were doing it, and they were doing it illegally. But I think that if the outcome was different, that they would have gotten exactly what they wanted, which is the fucked up part about it. And they, with pretty much impunity, go back and forth into the United States, right? Or into places that would ultimately come under the control of the United States anyway. Right. They cross back into Texas, they come back out, then they're in Tucson, which would be Spanish at the time. They don't go to Santa Fe, which would be well established, I think, at this point. Santa Fe was established in the 1500s, which a lot of people forget about. And then,
oh wow,
I didn't. And then, San Diego and all of that, which would come later during the Mexican session. And this is all happening in the background anyway. They don't really get into the politics, which is so interesting.
No,
the United States really did just. And it's for better or for worse. We can talk about this later about colonialism and kind of conquering land. But for better or for worse, the United States literally did just be like, we're just going to take all of this. And right up to World War I and World War II, especially in World War I with what people can read about called the Zimmerman telegram. But in World War II, the Nazis were playing around with this as well, which was like Mexico get involved and attack the United States from the south, and we'll give you your land back, from this period. So what do you think about the whole filibustering thing? Or did you read anything about it? Did you investigate more about the reality of it? Is it something that would, because it really does sound like a lo-fi Metal Gear Solid situation. And I love it. Like
it really does.
Some PMC lands with horses instead of tanks in Nicaragua with 1,000 men. And they're like, we're just going to try to make an American state here and see what happens.
It's so funny, man.
Yeah.
How did anybody survive back then?
Yeah, that's the whole thing.
It's insanity. It's absolute insanity. You survived by the grace of God, or thank God there were some good people that humanity managed to somehow survive, if not prosper, right? Because you said it. I mean, this backdrop, this landscape of this time and this place, it was about starting to westernize or expand and implement law, but it's still, as you said, largely lawless. So it was every man for himself. And it was about survival. And my sense was that, and I don't know how correct I am about this, but a lot of this about clearing a way, clearing a path through the savages or annihilating the American Indians and stuff like that was in order to set the stage or clear the way for the gold rush. And not just to obtain the gold, but the business and the money and the profiteering that would surround the expansion west. In other words, building towns, building restaurants, hotels, that sort of thing. So that's a really interesting part to me. But the fact that the places, the cities that had an excess of gold, one of the things that they did was actually pay people to hunt Indians and bring back their scalps for a profit for $100 a head or whatever it was back then. 100 gold pieces or whatever.
Preemptive combat. It's interesting. You know,
it was sanctioned.
Yeah, exactly. It's like total preemptive, like culling. It's very, very weird. Just because it could have gone a different way. I don't think anything was going to stop everyone from expanding west, but it could have gone differently if we weren't all so violent. Although I'm not foolish enough to think that the Indians didn't respond violently. I just don't necessarily blame them. I don't know. Anyway, I interrupted you. Good.
No, not at all. I mean, that's the thing too. And you know, what we learned when we were young, when we were little and learning about the Pilgrims and Indians, but even more so as we get older, it's like there were Indians, there were American Indians and natives that dealt with, violence. And there were Native Americans, sects of American Indians that dealt with the newcomers, the settlement and the settlers in peaceful ways and traded and all that sort of thing. So that's interesting too. And then the filibustering, as far as I didn't see that much of a difference between the filibustering and the scalping. It was like almost like a one and the same thing. It was kind of the same idea. They even go into the one guy, the Van Diemen Lander, which I guess was, I had to look this up, was the people in Tasmania, where they would go over to Tasmania and hunt the Aborigines. It was the same thing. This was just happening everywhere. As Colin said, it was about expansion, and it was about profiteering, and it was about furthering your own ends as individuals and claiming your own land and planting your own stake and all that kind of stuff. It's such an interesting time.
And how it also fit into like a kind of a primitive race science, which I think is interesting too. About they throw around the N word in this book, which is but it's everyone.
Yes.
Like whoever. They're almost never talking about a black person. Yeah. Right? Like, except for that character Jackson, they almost are never talking about a black person when they use that, and how they had to kind of fit it within the contemporaneous nature of their racial worldview that the Indians, I think, I'm pretty sure that the Mormons think the Indians were like the Israelis or the Israelites, right? Or the Israelites.
I don't know.
In biblical times, but I think that's the whole thing with the Indians and the Mormons. Okay. But I think that like there was some, like, they're not quite that, but we have, in their mind, they're obviously not quite that in reality. I mean, we know that, but in their minds, I think they had to like demean them to the point to like make them indistinguishable from their own slaves, basically. And you found out that even the Indians had slaves, like Mexican slaves, which was interesting.
I never knew that.
So, but yeah, like that was, they say that in the book, I think, right?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think there's one point where they say like there's like some tribe they encounter that has like slaves that are Mexican. I think that's.
Oh, you know what? I think you might be right. I didn't even take them from. I never knew that the Native Americans were referred to as the N-word. I never knew that before, but it's all over this book. It's one thing that's a little jarring to get used to, because McCarthy does not shy away from using it. If he puts you in that time and place and he really wants to immerse you in how it was, again, he doesn't shy from it. It's in there, and it seems like he doesn't hold back. He doesn't refrain from it. That was a tough one for me, but I believe that's how it was. I mean, and the nature of these people that we're dealing with primarily in the book too are the ones using that language.
Right. Exactly. I don't swoon when I see the word in fiction. It's like, it's fiction, like what the fuck do you think is going on here?
1985 though.
Sure. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
So, but it's like when people read Huck Finn or something like a classic, like a Twain classic, it's like, get over it, stop. Read it through the lens of the 19th century, fucking moron.
That's what you have to do.
Like, do I have to tell you that? Is what we were saying earlier when I was saying, like, why are there on Netflix shows? It's like, they're cigarette smoking. It's like, can you shut the fuck up, please?
Kyle, like, you know what the other thing is that
go on,
with this book,
yeah,
in this time period, especially we're in primarily 1849, 1850 for a large part of the book, which predates the Civil War by what? The better part of a dozen years, 10 to a dozen years, right? It seems like a long time ago, but it really, what strikes me about it, oftentimes, not with this book, but just anything dealing with this time period, is that it's not that long ago. Like, think about it, right? We were celebrating the bicentennial in this country in 1976, right? It's like, it hasn't been that long. Think about it in the context. Like, we had a grandma that lived, a great-great-grandma that lived to 106 or whatever she lived to. That's insane. Like, this really wasn't that long ago. Look how far,
I think it was 104, I want to say.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
She, you know, like, that's, you know, you're only dealing with a couple hundred years, 250 years, 300 years. It's like not that long. So that's the thing about, you know, you think back, it's like, holy shit. Really, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that long ago. It's pretty amazing. And I love, you know, I had to look too, Kyle, for you. I said 1849, 1850, it's Fillmore, right? It's Taylor. These presidents, I have no idea who they are or what, you know, these are the presidents you never hear about.
Right.
Because this isn't the Revolution. This isn't the Civil War. It's not World War I. It's kind of like a time period that you never hear about for some reason.
Yeah, I honestly think that part of it is the whole, and I'm reducing this a lot, so I don't want to hear it from people, but you can say whatever you want, of course, but the Mexican-American War was, do you know anything about it? I mean, do you know? Like,
not really, no.
So Texas was founded as a country, which is an important thing, right? It wasn't founded as a state. It's, I think, only one of two countries that were absorbed into the United States, the other being Vermont, I think.
Okay.
And so, but the Texas Revolution was fought, and at the same time, they were fighting the Mexicans, like this new kind of nascent Mexican nation that was formulating out of Spanish colonial territories, plus like indigenous populations, which is really what it is today. And they disputed the Texas independence movement, and then the United States annexed Texas, right? And the Mexicans still didn't accept that, which drew us into basically an invasion of Mexico in, I think it was 1846, 1847. We took Mexico City. Winifred Scott, who you probably know, that name, because he was famous in the Civil War, a lot of people became famous from the Mexican-American War that like were fought in that war and later became like the generals and the colonels and stuff of the Civil War. And which is why I think it's so fascinating that Blood Meridian skips all of that. Like, they don't talk about the Civil War basically at all, which is so weird.
Yeah, it is strange.
And it's interesting. But so the United States ends up seizing a bunch of land. So that's like New Mexico, Arizona, Wyoming, you know, like all of these different parts of California and so on and so forth. And we just take the entire thing. And that was not a great moment for the United States. I mean, it was like total colonial seizure, like that you've never really seen again. And we only expanded 3 more times after that, because we had what was called the Gadsden Purchase. I don't know if you know about that. Like, that's there's like a little piece of Arizona and New Mexico that Mexico took or kept, and we bought it from them after the Mexican-American War. And this was literally just to build a railroad. So that was one thing. And then Hawaii and Alaska, rather. I'm sorry.
Okay.
But the entire time, you know, like the War of 1812, the United States invaded Canada. If that war went different, we would have taken it. The United States would be the entire continent, basically, going all the way down to Mexico and maybe even further south, because maybe we would have been more emboldened during the Mexican-American War to seize as much as we possibly could. We could have been a huge empire, basically. And so I think that I say all that because I think part of the reason why we don't talk much about that part of American history is because there's not much positive to say about it. I mean, it was what it was. And I'm really curious to get into the discussion of Indians and colonialism and manifest destiny and taking over and kind of the eradication of that way of life and all of that, and what you think about that. Because I think it is such a deep issue, and I don't think the answers are easy. But I think what's true is that, it's like I've been listening to that Faith No More song lately. We care a lot. It's a dirty job, but someone's got to do it. Like that would be someone's definition of expanding westward and all that came along with it. It's just that Blood Meridian showed you what came along with it, not just the expansion and be like, oh, now we founded San Francisco and now we have a port in San Diego. And so it's like, it just didn't happen like that. There was incredible unmitigated violence against Native people to a degree that I think chills anyone's heart. And that's why I wonder if it could have been different. And I just don't know enough about not only this period, but also the Indian Wars that culminated after the Civil War, when we basically just put an end to the Indian populations in that's like, that's Custer and everyone. And that's more out in the north, like in the Rockies and in that area in the plains. This obviously was in the South, not in the South, in the Southwest. So that's a long-winded way of saying, Dig, that I think that's why we don't talk about it.
Yeah.
It's because not like, what are you going to say? I mean, we basically took a state in knowing they were under assault. It's like Ukraine joining NATO now.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, yeah, they're going to join, they're going to be invaded, and then we're going to be in, right? And it's the same situation that we found ourselves in, or at least that was the excuse for why we ran fucking roughshod over Mexico. I mean, it was not even close, and I'm endlessly fascinated by that. But I think that unlike, the revolution or even antebellum America, where there was just a lot of peace, Madisonian America and all of that. Madisonian America had the War of 1812, but after that, Monroe, and John Quincy Adams and Jacksonian America, obviously. So I think that's kind of the long-winded answer, is there's just not much good to say about it.
It's true. Yeah, we had the Schoolhouse Rock version, and now you have the Cormac McCarthy version.
But let's get into it right now. Then I want to ask you. It's tough to talk about. I don't think I've ever really even put into words, at least since college, probably. The outcome of everything that's happened has been very good for not only America, but the world and the people that live within it, no matter what your color is, your creed, whatever. Conquering nations is as old as time. In fact, that's what the book is about. And it doesn't excuse it. It just says that it's kind of the facts on the ground in America are the facts on the ground really everywhere. And for some reason, I've always felt that the United States has gotten the brunt of that, though the displacement of native peoples goes back to the origins of civilization. It doesn't make it right. And it doesn't mean now that we're more enlightened in some sense, although the Enlightenment happened in the 17th and 18th centuries when this was going on, even before this was going on. So they also thought they were enlightened. But now I think we know, like what we're seeing again in Ukraine, like territorial expansion, like we look down upon that. We don't like that. But the United States doing that is no different than the way Europe was founded, the way places like Spain were even founded, and the Moors, and obviously African colonial endeavors were horrifying too. Things that happened in the Middle East and in India were horrifying too. But I guess what I'm saying is that it's difficult to understand how you could be against the outcome, but it is also difficult to understand how you cannot possibly look at something like this and think that there could have been another way to do this. I don't know how, and I understand fully, especially people on the right, like more historical revisionism will be like, well, the Indians were never going to let that happen. And I'm like, I get that that's probably true, but it's just the death and destruction. It fucking sucks. And it's horrible, and it's true. I mean, indiscriminate slaughter of entire native populations is nothing for the United States to be proud of. But we also happen to also live on that land. And I've seen people joking around about it lately. Like when you listen to Microsoft, like at the company in Washington, they have like, press conferences, or they do like internal things, sure, yeah. And they have their land acknowledgements. And I'm like, and I've seen people write recently, like you're basically, that's actually like kind of an own, because you're basically like saying like, we've conquered all these people. Now we like acknowledge them, and it's a very fraught and fascinating thing. And coming from Long Island, very Native American place before the British eradicated them a long ass time ago. And the only remnants of that really are the names of the towns on Long Island.
Sure. Yeah.
so there, I don't know. There's so many things to say about it, but I'm curious what you think about that idea of it being so objectively horrifying, in some ways even more horrifying than I ever appreciated as a kid, even studying history in college. As I got older and really like internalizing the violence and how anti-violent I've become in my own outlook on war and peoples and all of the different things like that. But you have to balance it with the outcome. And would you really have wanted it to be any other way? Would you want to be born in that fucking world? I mean, seriously, ask yourself that question. So it's very complex. I don't think a lot of people have the balls to talk about it because it's too complex, and some people sound stupid saying it, but I think everyone knows exactly what you're saying when you're saying like the method was horrifying, the outcome good, for all of us. What do you think? Am I wrong?
Yeah, I mean, it's a painful thing to talk about. It's a hard thing to talk about. It's none of us want to really. It's not pleasant, right? It's ugly. It's hard, if not impossible, to candy coat, right? And I think a lot of what you say is true, specifically about the United States, Kyle, just in the sheer context of that. Yes, this is the way the Earth was built, but the United States, it's the freshest with us, right? Because we're the newest, we're the latest, we're the newest player in the game, although it's been hundreds of years. But what the thing is, it is terrible, and there always seems to be something with the United States too. And I don't know if I'm justified in thinking this, where I think a large part of it too, with the United States specifically and our history with breaking away from another entity and wanting to be independent, a large part of it's hypocrisy, that we kind of, in some sense, knew what it felt like, and to come and be the oppressor. Oh, and in pretty rapid succession, by the way. It didn't happen overnight, but it was pretty quick, right? Where this whole thing was unraveling, and the nature of the United States would be what it would become today. It always does seem like a lot of it is hypocrisy. It's hypocritical. And I do, you plant a seed there for me, because I do wonder if it could have been done differently. You do wonder about that. It reminds me, and again, I don't mean to compare apples and oranges, but it does remind me of us, the United States and Japan in World War II, and dropping the bombs. It's like, would there that infernal question of, could it have ended any other way? And I know your feelings about that with Japan and how impossible it was and how they would have fought to the person.
Well, I just think that they had the chance to if they were going to, they thought we only had one bomb.
Right.
That was their mistake. And they should have surrendered, after the first one. I don't think it was I am very much of the mind that you would not have liked the history we'd be learning right now about the war in World War, at the end of the war in Japan, when we would have lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers.
Yeah, it would have been ugly on a whole
Sorry,
different
like we did
front.
what we had to do. I know that's rough, but that is how I feel. Like, we didn't ask for that war. They attacked us. So, and I know that there's embargoes and I know there's complexities. I get it. I studied it very deeply.
Right.
But I really am of the mind. I can't remember the name of the book. It's in my Kindle, actually. It's a book that makes the argument as to why it was necessary. I think it's called Operation Downfall or something like that. And it's written by a guy with an Italian name. That's what I remember about it. But it makes the argument basically like, here's all the documents. Here's the consensus of how many people were going to die, what was going to be necessary, what the Japanese were going to do, and what we were going to have to do to them in order to make them surrender. When you're arming children with bamboo sticks, when you're teaching little kids to roll under tanks and put bombs under them, when you're like, it's like, do you understand that we would have had to kill maybe millions of Japanese people? Yeah.
It's that ultimate thing of the lesser, not to paint it with such a broad brush, but the lesser of two evils.
No, but that is it. And see, that's why I think it's so important in these tough conversations to literally put your shoulder into it and say it like that, because it is
right.
Like that is simply the case. It would be a lot different if the United States attacked Japan and just uninstigated, just like, we're dropping nuclear weapons on you.
Yeah.
But that's not what happened.
In an empirical way, or.
Right. Or just as an empire, just as an evil expansionist hegemony that you want to. but that's not what happened.
No,
and I think that any use of a nuclear weapon today would be like insane to do, because I also think that was the one time you can get away with it, not because no one else had one to retaliate, but because we didn't quite understand what we were doing.
No. Yeah.
And so that's a topic for another time. But I actually think that again, when we're talking about Venn diagrams, there's a Venn diagram between that and this in terms of difficult conversations about historical events and the outcomes of those events.
Yeah.
Because it's like, well, it's funny. A lot of people talk about this with South America and Central America, and even into Mexico with like what would have been the Aztecs, I guess, and the Spanish, and everything that was going on in those fights. And it's like, well, that was a horrible situation full of unnecessary death and destruction and all of that. But the outcome of that on the South American continent was the creation of countries where the standard of living is higher than anything ever achieved by any of those tribes. I mean, so like, would you have rather lived like that, or would you have rather outcomes that give us this? And I feel like that's the core hypocrisy of saying like how horrible it is with no reservation, because it's like, okay, so go live in a fucking hut then, go live in the woods, go do if that's really what it's all about. I mean, that's cool. But to me, I think that there's something to say about Western civilization, but at the same time, again, a book like the Blood Meridian makes you internalize and read about, like I said, the gold rush, the Oregon Trail, like
yeah,
Lewis and Clark are having like violent encounters on a constant basis with fucking Indians,
It's painful,
I don't know. I think I'm going on, but I just think it's important to say like, yeah, the violence happened. Now, how do you react today? And in my opinion, I say you keep the status quo and you try to live a peaceful life where everyone, including the indigenous, have an equal say in the society, and that's the best way you can do it, because it's so funny, Dave, like even our people weren't involved in any of this. So like, even when it's like we're like net beneficiaries, like we don't even have to hold the familial guilt of like the Indian Wars or whatever. Like our people weren't there. We were downtrodden fucking Irish people at that time. And the Italian side of the family wasn't even here anywhere close to being here at that point. So there's that extra level too, where those aren't like Stan's people or whatever. They're not we're not their ancestors, or whatever. Like those are other people, but we're all kind of here.
Right.
And you just
we
make
all
do.
Look alike,
and you do the best you can. Like it almost doesn't matter. But again, the Blood Meridian reminds you it does matter. So.
And it's good. I like it. It's painful. Look, it's inevitable. As humans, we're introspective. So I think any reasonable person's going to ask that question of woulda, coulda, shoulda, right? How could it have went? And, who knows? That's the thing. But I like having to confront it as a person and spelling it out with, on no uncertain terms, and not the Schoolhouse Rock version. Look, this is how it happened. And that's the painful part is, yeah, man, this is that, the brutality. The other thing that makes me think, and I think I'm not educated on this front, is I wonder about the various human reaction from the Native American perspective. In other words, the militant, warlike tribes that responded with action, and the ones that were more conducive to peace and trade and sharing the land and parceling things out for everybody. And how much do you hear about the brutality and the horrific nature of the Apache and the Comanche and stuff like that. But how much of that was already their way, and how much of it was brought on by them being invaded, and how much of it was existing and how much of it was defensive, I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, yeah, I mean,
another interesting thing. I really don't know.
Well, that's the whole thing, is that it's like I said earlier, I don't blame the Indians' response being as violent as necessary. I mean, we're on their land, but thus and again, this is the tough thing, is like, that's just the way it's kind of been for all of humanity. And people say like, it's still, well, would it still be that way? And so I'm like, well, if you want to come and take the land by force, I guess you can try, but I don't think that's going to happen. So I guess theoretically the laws of nature still exist today as they did back then. It's just, and that's why I said like, we're more enlightened, but through a modern lens of enlightenment. Because again, the Enlightenment philosophers were the ones that were supporting this kind of behavior. So, but they thought they were, baptizing people, and it was a religious thing. And I think a lot of that was just excuse making. People just wanted land and power and money and access to natural resources. And it doesn't make any of it right. It just means that it is what it is. And so I assume we're seeing now that, for instance, again, with the Ukraine situation, where the natural inclination of a modern people is to say like, no, we don't do that anymore.
Right.
And that's good. Because I think that if we tried to invade Mexico now, I would hope that there would be a global group against us saying like, you can't do that, and so, yeah, times are different. It's just unfortunate that this was like the latest of tens of thousands of years of this. The Indians were destroying each other over many generations. The Indians and a lot of people don't think about this, but we only know this from the archaeological record and the hard work of archaeologists and anthropologists and everything, is that many of the Indians that were encountered by the earliest colonial settlers on the eastern coast of the United States were not the original Indians that lived on that land. They conquered it. They themselves conquered it. That's
interesting.
Never
think of that.
Right. Like, people came across the Bering Land Strait 10,000 years ago, and they dispersed, and then they all went into groups and all these things. And you don't think nothing happened? Like, come on, man. They were all conquering and fucking around with each other. That's the way it went, even for them. It doesn't make it right. It's simply to say that that's what happened. I mean, it's a joke now with people in more revisionist history, but when the conquistadors encountered native tribes in South America, a lot of them were like, these guys are fucking crazy. Like, human sacrifices, baby sacrifices, all bloodletting, and all this kind of. It's like we didn't. It wasn't all like roses and honey, bees flying around, beautiful pastures. It wasn't like that. It was also brutal. And you would assume they did a lot of that stuff to each other, and you would assume if they could have gotten into boats and went somewhere else and did it, they would have.
That's interesting. That's an interesting perspective. Yeah. We don't think about it.
I mean, that's the reality. It doesn't make it right or wrong. It's simply the reality. I'm not endorsing it.
No,
I didn't make up human history, and I also didn't make up human nature.
You're making me think of so much right now, because you grew up a little later, but I'll give you my 1970s, early to mid 80s perspective, is that we learned this stuff about the Native Americans and the settlers at a very early age. And by the time we were probably, honestly, in second grade, that whole part of history was no longer really taught until maybe we touched on things in high school. But by no means was that a major part of what we learned in terms of social studies. We just didn't. I remember that being somewhat glazed over, to the point of being pretty young and feeling like you're glazing over this, if that makes sense. And in a context of, I think, whatever you want to say, difficulty, guilt, the reality of the situation. But McCarthy does plant you firmly in this time period, in this place. And if you read this book, at least I'm left with the sensation of, how did anybody survive, let alone have a family, run a sustainable farm, run a business? Because it really does feel lawless. You think about it from a modern perspective, it's like, we have alarm systems in our cars and in our homes, and good steel locks on the doors and things like this. And these people, they basically survived by, their wits, and it seemed like luck played a huge part, and just, thank goodness there were, it seemed like anybody was capable of anything. Anybody could have committed any atrocity at any time and got away with it. So it's amazing that some people we're good. If that makes sense.
No, I think Dustin and I have this conversation sometimes about if people are inherently good or not. He thinks people are not inherently good. And I think people are inherently good. Like that. I think that this is what makes it so interesting, because you have to read between the lines in the writing. I think there are multiple scenes where he describes a people like in a field. I think one of them is like people picking cotton, and they're being invaded by some group, and they're hitting the ground and they're running and they're screaming and they're getting fucking cut down. It indicates that there's a lot of nothing going on, and that most of your encounters are peaceful, or at least made in mutual outcomes for, like, you're trading, you need food or whatever. And so you treat people with respect. You hope not to get fucked up by someone. So you don't want to fuck anyone else up. You don't want to get a reputation and all of that. And the argument is that a lot of stuff just keeps us in line. And I've made this argument myself, that I think the world is generally becoming safer, at least in the West, because unfortunately, for better or worse, you're being watched at all times in ways that you don't understand. And it's just impossible to get away with anything. So for people that are self-aware, it forces you to be honest. Like, you're driving in a car with your cell phone, they're fucking pinging every tower around you. They know exactly where you are. Like, oh, you're walking out of someone's house after killing them. You just got caught on 2 different Ring doorbells.
Yeah.
But back then people were just getting away with shit. And you see that in this, that people have bounties on them. There's reputations. They're chasing down scouts so that they don't they don't report back some of their activities to greater forces that can come after them. So I agree with you. It's interesting, but I think it would be boring writing to let us know that for the most part, nothing's happening at all, I guess. But it does seem so violent and lost. It's truly like small L libertarian. And there's that whole idea of the sheriff and all this kind of stuff. Like, I'm the law in this town. Like, you just needed like someone with like some authority.
Maybe it had some impact, but not much.
Right. And I think it would be like judge, jury, and executioner, right? Like, this man was stealing from the till, fucking string him up. And then like 5 minutes later, he's hanging from a rafter somewhere in town. People are going about their business. So it's not like that was good either. It's just, I don't know. I agree with you. It seems so fucking crazy. I think it shows like there's a mixture of daring and boldness, but also desperation. You have to imagine how desperate people were. Because one of the cool things, it's not cool, but one of the interesting things in this book is that over and over again, he's describing people that have nothing.
Right.
Like literally whatever is on their back, and that's it. And so these are people that are willing to do whatever and risk whatever, because it's obviously not working for them somewhere else. Or maybe they were born into this kind of more frontier situation. But that's crazy, man. And people thought it was crazy to go to Ohio and Indiana and all that, but that's really nothing compared to going all the way out there, especially because there's no water. There's not, like, you can't do it. It's really questionable why anyone was even interested. It really does go to show you it was just a land rush, and obviously gold and all of these different things, and all they bring it up multiple times. They're mining copper, they're mining silver, they're doing all these things. But generally speaking, it just goes to show how late colonial it was, where it's like, just whatever, just get whatever you can.
Yeah. The conditions, as far as the terrain, as far as the weather, it's just so harsh. Just surviving, just to get water, is unbelievable. The thing too, about this book that's interesting to me is McCarthy does this thing where he uses language in this way, I guess. Well, let me put it to you this way. You're following this kid, this teenage character, who's sort of a badass. Is he redeemable? Is he not? We're seeing a lot of this world through his lens. He's interacting with characters like this Captain Glanton and this ex-priest and the judge. But what's really interesting, and what makes it even scarier and a little more troubling and a little more haunting, I think this book, that's a good word for this book, is that it's haunting. And I like spooky, dark stuff. I like haunting myself, right? But what McCarthy does is, even though you're seeing this world through these characters, he has this weird third-person-ish omniscient narrator who kind of sees and knows all. And it's a very interesting and creepy perspective, because sometimes the gang, let's say the Glanton gang, rolls into town. And the writer will say something, the narrator will say something like, they doff their hats to the townsfolk that they would all murder just 3 days later. You know, like the narrator will say, or he'll say, Glanton will roll into town and, you know, he'll have this confrontation. He'll survive this time, but eventually he knows he'll never see his wife and kid again. So, you know, Glanton's going to die chapters before he actually dies.
Yeah, there was a cool one too where he said he noticed some guy's tattoo and it would be the tattoo he noted when he cut the guy down from a tree or some shit like that. Yeah.
That's kind of stuff. That omniscient narrator is very creepy in this context for me. Did it affect you the same way?
Yeah, it is. It's a lot of foreshadowing, like very literal foreshadowing going on. Yeah, I like omniscient narrators generally. I like the idea that you're only being fed what is necessary for you to know for the story to be riveting, that there's so much more information as opposed to you kind of experiencing it firsthand. There's something very appealing with prose with that for me. But yeah, and I think, but it's funny because the haunting nature of it does, in my opinion, become a little rote because, and I think that it comes through in the descriptions of some of the stuff, like how many, I mentioned earlier, they come across like a burned out wagon. They come across an abandoned village or farmstead or whatever. And eventually it's just like, all right, I get it. Like everything's fucked up. It becomes almost very second nature, which I think is probably the point ultimately in the book as you're going through it, is to just kind of be nonplussed by the incessant amount of violence and that maybe is the human nature and the acceptance of all of that. But it could have been more haunting, I think, if they show, and he wouldn't do this anyway, but like showing more of the normalcy or even some of the highs, because every high is accompanied by something weird or fucked up. Every party is on the back of them delivering tons of scalps. The best that the kid probably feels and is when he meets Captain White, and that lasts for 2 seconds before they're fucking wiped out. Right?
That's brutal.
It's so fascinating. So they never really marinate on any of that. So the violence, it's like, yeah, the blood going into the clay and the bones whittling in the sun turning white. It's like, yeah, like you describe it over and over again. And I wonder if that's just like kind of a hammer hitting a nail. But yeah, it is something very haunting about it. Because you wonder, it seems fairly obvious that the kid has to last to the end of the book. So you're just wondering who else will possibly live. And I think the most frustrating part of it was when he had the opportunity to take a shot and he didn't, you know?
Yeah.
And then all of this time passes and then it comes back to apparently bite him, although it's unclear to me.
It's so interesting. He's such an interesting character because I think the whole thing is redemption. Can somebody like the kid be born into his situation in this harsh world, which we've talked about, and sort of survive with some semblance of goodness? Can he be redeemed? Can he be more like the priest, who I would argue is also a manipulator in some ways? I don't think the priest is the good guy necessarily. Or will he be convinced by the judge? I think the judge sees the kid. Once the kid gets in that bar fight with the bar owner and stabs him in the eye with the bottle over, you know, let me sweep the floor for some whiskey, they give him a hard time. The kid brutally kills this barkeep. I think the judge sees the kid as a would-be protege and sort of wants to take him under his wing. Later on, he says, over the arc of the story, that you were a disappointment to me. So in other words, I couldn't win you over like I wanted to. But that's the whole thing, is can this, you know, where this kid shows some semblance of some glimpses of goodness throughout the story, but he's also a brutal killer. So he's, again, that, I guess he represents humanity and being pulled between good and evil. And it's interesting, but I think what's really interesting is the antagonist. I think that's really what keeps you. Besides the writing, I think the judge is such a compelling character because you're like, who the hell? He's such an interesting dude because, again, he's not that hand-wringing supervillain. He's not the Joker. He's something else. You know, he's learned. He speaks every language. He's literally super skilled, like immaculately skillful at everything he does. He's a master diplomat. He has a silver tongue, right? He doesn't, even though they know he's committing atrocities, they don't really know that every time they roll into a village, a little kid ends up raped and murdered. And they know it's the judge. They kind of know it's him, but they never confront him about it. right? He's able to get away with his crimes. He's a supervillain on a very psychological, cerebral level, not just physical. He's also a master of combat. He's also he's a master tactician. He knows weapons. He knows how to, craft his own gunpowder out of brimstone and sulfur on a volcanic ridge in the middle of the desert. But he's such an interesting character because he's pulling all the puppet strings. He's really the puppet master. So I think a lot of it, once you get to know this character, like, who the hell is this guy? And also, it's hinted, there's a lot of hints that there's something supernatural going on with this, whether it's the priest talking about the little hoof prints on the rim of the volcano, or Reverend Green in the beginning saying that's Satan, or the judge himself saying, he'll never die. It says he'll never die. This is what makes the world go around, or proselytizing war, and, all that sort of thing. This is a really compelling villain. And I think Cormac McCarthy gives you just enough to ask the questions, but he doesn't spoon feed you the answers. We talk about that a lot on the show. That's just good storytelling. And in this case, that's good literature. The
Mennonite at the bar that they meet portends a omen too for them, which is interesting. Another religious touchstone. I think the kid sets a cadence early that he's not going to buck the trend of violence when he meets the herders and they leave him with like a knife and beans and whatever, and then he lies about them later, which is like a throwaway line. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like he says something about like he says something about how like they mistreated him or did something to him, and it's like the exact opposite. Like he just had no reason to lie about that. They helped him survive and like fed him, and gave him things. He gave him a horse, I think. So I don't know. I think early on you realize the kid's not like a protagonist worth rooting for.
He's doomed. Yeah, and the lady in the beginning saves his life, right? He shot the lady.
Right, that's right. And then he leaves without paying her.
He leaves in the night without paying.
Yeah. Right. That's exactly right. That's a good point. All right, let me see here. I'm going through. Oh, I wanted to call out a couple of scenes that I thought were cool. We can talk about whatever you want, of course. The scene where Glanton has the gun and kills the cat. I love that scene. He shoots a cat and they say that it basically just disappears from the earth or whatever. And then he shoots like a bunch of birds and then a goat and then a jar. And then he shoots a bell in a tower, which I think is hysterical. Like I actually laughed at that line. Reminded me a little bit of Resident Evil 4 remake. And I thought that was just a funny imagery. I wanted to throw that out there. And I said, I wrote down also, we talked about this, but just the mystical story of the judge being found by Tobin in the middle of nowhere or whatever. And he has like his metals, his fine metals, and then guns, ammo, no water, no food, sitting on a rock. And then they use like guano or whatever and to make gunpowder and sulfur, like you said. And they lure the Indians in, and the judge makes his case for, I guess, his leadership, or at least I don't know if he's like their literal leader or if they just kind of defer to him, but I think he proves himself there. And I like that scene a lot. Just to underline that. What about the Apache infant that they capture? This is a fucking weird one. Toadvine actually threatens to kill the judge at this point. And he holds this is another moment where he could have done it. He had the gun apparently to his head. And I think the judge said something like, do it or don't. Like, and then they just go on about their business. But what did you make of them kind of, you don't see how it happens. I don't know if this insinuation is sexual. It might be. But that the baby they're kind of like, they're feeding it and having a good time with him. And then I was wondering, I'm like, are they going to fucking bring this thing with them or something? And then of course not. I mean, they just immediately kill the kid. What do you think about that scene?
Yeah, the judge has the little baby native, right? And he's bouncing him on his knee and playing with him all day. And then apparently he just murders him. And that's the striking thing about scenes like this. This is a posse of really despicable people. This guy is so despicable that one of the most other despicable people wants to blow his head off for being so, horrendously evil. And this is the trend that you see with the judge. Every time they go into a place, a kid ends up dead. And I think the first example was the little 11-year-old girl, and they said she had very distinctive handprints around her throat. She was strangled to death. And it's said that it's interesting if you realize that you think the judge is so big and imposing, but they say he has small hands, super small hands, unusually small for his size. So it had to be him, but no one confronts him about it. Every time, this trend of kids ending up dead will be like a trail of breadcrumbs through the book. And this one is super disturbing because you do think, oh, the judge is being nice. He has candy on him. He's a really, really insidious character because I think the ex-priest, Tobin, says it at one point when he's telling the kid about meeting the judge for the first time. He said, I thought him to be a lunatic and then not. And he was saying, even as he's telling the story to the kid, I'm still not sure what this guy, I have no idea. I've made this guy a study for as long as I've known him, and I still can't figure him out, which is so interesting because he's that insidiously evil. And the fact that they know it's him and he's still manipulating them and leading them. And that's the other interesting thing, Kyle, that you said. He's not the leader of this group. He's at best the second in command. You know, he gives the whole thing as a guise over his influence. If he led the group and it was the outright leader, it would be too obvious almost. He's got to pull the puppet strings from behind Glenn. He puts this other guy in place and he takes, you know, sort of a lieutenant role, which is, again, just a really evocative of his nature, you know, of the deception and the evil that goes along with this character. He's so interesting.
Yeah, I find it's funny you talk about the wanton nature of humanity and human life and kind of how they disregard it. Did you notice that they seem to underline that they don't feel that way about dogs and wolves, and that people get upset when wolves are mistreated? Like one of the scenes when the judge throws those two pups over the cliff or whatever. And that's another one of those scenes where someone threatens to kill him. But did you notice that they like seem to actually like their animals much more than, like, they treat their animals a lot better than the humans, specifically the horses that they like or that can survive.
I would never shoot a wolf. That's the whole, that's a whole part. Yeah. Is that the nature? Did I learn this from Sopranos? That's the nature of a sociopath, only having empathy for animals and babies. They don't have empathy for babies, by the way. To get ready for some disturbing baby stuff in this. But yeah, that's another interesting thing, is that they have no regard for humanity, but they're pissed when the judge throws the puppies in the river, which is another thing. It's like, how evil can this guy be? I think Tobin says at one point, there's evil so terrible on this earth that the fires cough them back up. Like that hell doesn't even want this level of evil, which I think is so crazy. Like, that's such an interesting notion.
I love this the scene, I wanted to call it, and this was in Chihuahua City. I think I'm saying that right. Where they have a feast and they all, like, regardless of their station or their rank, they all dine together. And there's a scene there where the Mexicans, to be good hosts, are like referencing Washington and Jefferson, and that they don't know anything about Mexican history, so they don't say any. They just also support their own guys. Or whatever. I thought that was just really funny and understated. And obviously, the continuous violence here leads to the rescinding of the bounties, which they're basically out of money now, and they can't pay for any more scalps. And a lot of the scalps aren't even authentic anyway. They're just scalping any way they can get. I did want to ask you on that note, though, what do you think of this idea of scalping? This is a central part of the book. It happens over and over and over and over and over again. And unlike other verbs, he doesn't really play around with the verb scalp. He kind of just uses that word over and over again.
That's true. Yeah.
They can be nouns too. The scalping, and it's so violent and it's so funny. We were talking about our education as like Americans, right? And like how we don't really learn the true violent nature of things and the way things really were. Is that I recall growing up in my kind of formative times, understanding that scalping was something the Indians did to us. And I think they probably did, but they certainly didn't say when I was a kid, actually, we were scalping them to count the bodies and prove that we killed them. So that when we return, it's like, oh, why not a finger? Why not a hand? Why not? And it's like, no, the scalp. No, not an ear, which they also have the necklace of ears.
Too, yeah.
But it's like, no, the scalp. Like, you need the scalp. And I like how that one scene that when they fucking destroy that one village and there's a guy that's still alive with his scalp missing or whatever. And he's like walking around.
That happened.
It's it's nuts. And I was rankled by this. It's really gross. It's a horrible thing to do to someone. And it's just so, the casual violence is, again, it's just from another place in time. It's just unfathomable for me. I wouldn't want to kill an animal to eat it. And I love eating animals, but I'm not doing the killing. I think I would become a vegetarian if you made me kill my own animals, to be honest. That's my honest answer. I don't want to do it. We pay someone else to do that. I just think that this level of violence is obviously, it centers around the idea of scalping. And I was curious what you thought of that in this book.
Yeah, it's grotesque. I mean, talk about violent. And the idea of getting scalped alive is so frightening and intense that it's almost unthinkable. It's that, taking a trophy while your victim is alive. They're already defeated. Now you're taking. And that's another interesting point. You got characters in this wearing strings of ears and fingers. Some people are walking around with hearts, dried up jerky hearts and stuff like that. But why? The scalp is I understand the scalp is indicative of that's indicative of one victim, or, that's one checkbox. But yeah, it's so horrifically violent. And that whole scene with the Comanche attack, when the Comanche are scalping the Americans and they're walking around and they say their blood drenched scalps are getting full of dust and everything. It's so visceral and horrifying that you have to feel that and endure that until you bleed out. It's unbelievable. I mean, again, but just the horrific level of violence in that. And I don't know, just being capable of that, that it's interesting when you think about it in the context of, think about the angriest you've ever been. Okay. Think about the maddest you've ever been. You're just rootin' tootin'. You're super hot. Could you ever be angry enough to scalp somebody? No. I mean, that's like insanity.
It's hard for me to imagine killing someone, for any reason. Obviously not just in my general life. I would never do that, but that's why it's like, I wouldn't survive at all in these situations. I would have been long. I would have never, first of all, if I was born into the situation, I would have died. If I could have avoided the situation, I would have been smart enough to hopefully have done that. Violence is really anathema to me. Like, I used to be much more pro-war, as people know, like in the American military. And that's something I'm really ashamed of. But I was able to divorce it at a younger age from the acts of violence that are necessary to win war. And it never really shaped up with I always had somewhat of a pacifist personal outlook on life. Like, I don't want violent confrontations with people. I don't want to fucking shove people and punch people and get in people's faces. I really just want to live and let live and live a peaceful life. And I think that's the best way to do it. So I'm looking at it through my own experience and modernity, but I know I'm not made to do it. But then you really come up with these really fascinating moralistic and relativistic towards time questions, like slavery. It's like, who today would say, like, yeah, I would have had slaves? We all think we wouldn't have. That's the thing. I guess what I'm saying is, we don't really know what you would have done through that relativistic lens if you were there and you didn't know any better and you were in the situation and you only knew this, and this.
It's contextual.
I think, yeah, exactly. And I think it's really interesting to look at things through that, so that you're never above it, and so maybe I wouldn't have been above the violence either if that was all I ever knew. But I just don't think that I'm made for that stuff. It's not for me. Yeah. And yeah, so that the whole quest in the Southwest, I didn't mean to rhyme there. That Cormac McCarthy outlines in Blood Meridian is like really strange to me, because that just seems so unnecessary, right? We don't need room. The United States has so much space, and we still have an enormous amount of space. It's just tons of space in the US. Like, so it wasn't for room. It wasn't because it was like the most, you can even imagine if the Southwest of the United States was actually the Fertile Crescent, right? You're like, yeah, I'll go take that shit.
Oh,
like,
right,
what are you even going after, really? It's stupid. And ultimately it only ended up being mined a little bit, and there's some oil down there, and then
oils. Yeah.
And then but that's just, now it's just barren. It's nothing. It just exists within our boundaries. But it was like, you almost wonder about it. It's like, what did everyone do this for anyway? So that people could live in Tucson in air conditioning or something, or in Phoenix? fine cities, but I don't know. It's
that is an interesting perspective. Yeah. I mean, the only thing you could argue is the variety of terrain and climate and weather and stuff like that we have in this country, right? It's like we have the Northeast, and we have the Pine Barrens, and we have the Western North Shore and 2 oceans, and we have the desert and Texas and New Mexico and all that. Look at the variety we have. But yeah, that is an interesting point about golden oil, especially.
Certainly, and they didn't know anything about oil then.
Yeah,
but they would soon.
They weren't even there yet,
right? So, but they would be soon, and you could tell that the at least the book indicates that getting ore was not really a problem if you knew where to look. Like all sorts of people were traveling with tons of what in the book they would call specie, but like tons of different coins and different types of metals and raw metals and ore. And they even meet some of the dudes on the carrying some of the metals over and over again. And when the judge is found on that rock in that parable, he has a ton of gold and silver with him, which is interesting too. I wanted to ask you about I guess it's the famous scene with the judge, with the ex-priest, and about basically war always winning. And he says the mystery is that there is no mystery. What do you think about war and violence being the eternal and immortal truth of humanity? I guess we've kind of made the case, or at least I did. I want to speak for you. I kind of made the case that is indeed true, that maybe until the modern era, although we're still finding ways to kill each other in many different ways, is violence was the fact. The expansion, colonialism, raiding, like the Vikings and everything. It was a constant search for new plunder. It's like the Iron Islands in Game of Thrones, right? Like you don't live a sedentary life, but prey on other people. And I think that this is a lot about preying on other people, but there was never any need to do it then, obviously, and there's certainly no need to do it now. But do you think that, to the judge's point, that war always wins?
I think it's one of the most telling little soliloquies in any fiction concerning the way a character feels in all of their heart of hearts. Like the judge, love the judge, or hate the judge. This is how he really feels. Let me read this to you, Kyle. This is what he says. And this is one of those things. This is why you read this book. The way this is written is insane to me. Judge says, now they're debating around the campfire, the nature of war and evil and all that kind of stuff. This is what the judge says. He says, it makes no difference what men think of war. As well, ask men what they think of stone. War was always here. Before man was, war waited for him. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That is the way it was and will be. That way and not some other way. That's, to me, that I've rarely read anything written to that degree of what the fuck did I just read? How do you write that?
Yeah, it may as well ask men what they think of stone is an amazing line.
Unbelievable. It's like painting. It's like it's just saying it's inevitable. This is humanity. That's it.
One final scene I wanted to ask you about, and we can talk about whatever you'd like to talk about, but this is the end of my notes, is the whole thing with the ferry and the doctor. This to me broke down, and I wrote here in my notes because I wanted to not forget it. It's like this is like a proto mafia setup in some ways, maybe with like some more colonial and like we said, filibustering ambition. But they come across who seems like a perfectly nice and normal ferry operator who is just operating this random ferry across this river so people don't have to ford it, and the riders immediately go and find their Indian friends and conspire against the ferry. So they immediately just do the wrong thing. They have like the wrong instinct, and then they end up kind of seizing this thing from him. And like, they don't kill the doctor, but they just he gets killed eventually by the Yuma Indians. But he's kind of just like cast to the side, and they basically have a racket going. And it's, as I said earlier, I love that the racket is so substantial that the American military just doesn't even deal with it. Instead of doing something about it or dealing with it in some sort of, with some sort of eye for justice, they go around it and deal with some other ferry instead. And I just wanted to call that out as being it was such a strange thing. And eventually I think Glanton is killed in bed by one of the Indians that invades with a hatchet. And I don't know. I just wanted to throw that out there, that I thought that what did you think about that whole scene? I thought that was so strange. Like what was it trying to say? Just that violence for all intents and purposes is the name of the game, I guess, at this point.
I like your mafia connection, because this is maybe the first time in the book that we see them commit this type of violence, which is really strong arming, right? They're basically breaking down and taking over. It's for financial consideration this time, but they're not just going into a village and blatantly wiping everybody out. They're not just opening fire. They are first in cahoots with this ferry owner, this doctor, who kind of gets in bed with them out of fear or out of greed, whatever it is, and then gets to the point where the doctor just locks himself away in his cabin because he's finally had it or he feels threatened enough. And then it says, as this situation evolves, that Glanton and his gang just drop the guise of charging people on the ferry outright and just start robbing from them. Basically start stealing from them and taking advantage of them and raping the women and everything like that. But they started as this commercial operation where they're in cahoots. But this is what spells their doom, because they run afoul of the Yumas, and the Yumas eventually get their revenge and kill everybody but the judge and the priest and the kid and a few choice others. This will spell Glanton's doom. So this is their last thing before, I guess you could argue, fate catches up with them. But I do like that. It is a different take. It's almost like they're becoming a little more sophisticated. It's said earlier on that Glanton is sort of this master strategist, that he's kind of a brilliant tactician. So you would think somebody like that would have ideas for swindling and making money and taking advantage of people and stuff like that. But the ferry thing was interesting to me because it was a very early sort of example of, what the mafia would eventually do with restaurants or public transportation or, whatever, rackets. It's basically a racket.
Totally. And then actually I have one thing that happens right after this. When they go back to San Diego, this is with the character Brown. The whole sawed-off shotgun thing is so interesting. And I do love, actually, in leading up to that space, even in the book, where they're just being relentlessly pursued by different forces that are trying to capture them. And I'm always fascinated by it, like days long. I think one of the chases is 9 days, which is an incredible amount of, I don't know, you have to have like the constitution to be able to keep up with all of that. A lot of really interesting stuff. But at the end of that, Brown goes to jail. And after the sawed-off shotgun thing, bribes an American soldier to let him out and then kills the soldier. It's just like at every turn, like no one makes the decision to let someone live. Which is very, very strange. But those are all my notes on
Kill or Be Killed, my friend.
Those are all my notes on Blood Meridian, though. Do you have anything else you wanted to talk about? There's a bunch of different things we can say, I'm sure.
I love what you're saying about the duplicity. Like nothing is off the table. The only thing that's on the table is you surviving over the next guy.
Everything's
Friend
a trick.
Or foe.
Everything's a trick.
That's the nature of this world.
Yeah.
It's incredible. There's a couple of different, besides the one I read of the judge, which I think is just unbelievably brilliant. I think there's a couple of examples of the writing, because again, this comes down to the writing for me. There's one part, it's just a sentence, but there's one part in the book, sort of feels like a throwaway moment, where the Glanton gang's on the trail. They kind of run afoul accidentally of this bear who's feeding, this blonde bear that's feeding in the ditch. And the bear becomes, they rouse the fury of the bear. Glanton puts a few slugs in his chest, and the bear in his rage takes one of the Delaware Indians, and just plucks him off the horse in his fury and has him in his paw, like half in his mouth and half in his arm. And this is the way McCarthy writes about this moment. He says, "The man dangling from the bear's jaws and one arm about its neck like some crazed defector in a gesture of defiant camaraderie. In other words, it looks like this guy's palling around with the bear, but he's getting eaten.
Right.
That is insane. That when I first read that, I had to go back and maybe it was the first time I would acknowledge it on the audiobook. I had to go back and listen to it a couple of times because I was like, who? It's so clear what he's saying, but it's saying it in such a unique way. There's a million ways to say that. I don't think anybody would have ever wrote it like that, though. That's the brilliance. And another one, this is a really simple one, but this one struck me recently. I don't think I ever realized it before. I'm not even sure what character it is, but I think at one point, one of the Indian tribes is kind of bearing down on them. And it says, he started and in a frenzy groped for his weapons that were not there and were not there. And I was like, holy shit. That is a crazy, because you could feel him feeling around for his guns that he didn't have on his person for whatever reason, that he was roused out of bed or whatever. I thought that was so, I mean, that's writing. That's, to me, I think at the end of the day, the writing feels so inspired to me. I don't think it's Cormac McCarthy's best story. I like what you said early in the conversation, Kyle, about this sort of genre, like Western or cowboy stuff, because I always thought of it the same way as you too, like drab, sort of mundane. There's only so much you could do. I think in the 50s and 60s, when the kids were running around with their Daniel Boone hats and bow and arrows and playing cowboys and Indians, I think, in all fairness, I think that genre of fantasy or play or fiction was replaced by science fiction. And in a lot of ways, I think it's almost unfair to the Western genre, because how can cowboys and Indians stand in the face of, these bitchin' spaceships and laser guns and lightsabers and all these type of things, and just outer space in general, planets and robots and all that kind of thing. But this, for me, is maybe my favorite thing set in a Western genre, because I think really what it comes down to is the writing, but also the supernatural elements. Never do the two things mix in fiction. I feel like you don't really see the cowboy or Western genre portrayed with these supernatural or mystical or ethereal overtones. It's a rare thing. It's a special thing. And maybe that's what makes Blood Meridian stand out. And of course, specifically, I'm talking about the antagonist or the eventual antagonist and the judge. And that last, getting down to the beginning of the book, when we first meet the judge in the revival tent, all the way to the end where he has the last confrontation with the kid who is now the man in his mid-40s. And it's all but alluded to that the judge rapes and murders this person, the kid. That's how the kid ends up. Violently, horrifically, his body's found. The men who find the body, the ravaged body, can't even, they can't even speak about it. They're dumbfounded and they leave the outhouse in a hurry and stuff like that. It's pretty horrific. But the character of the judge is so fascinating for me. And he kind of brings that mysticism and that supernatural evil to Western that I can't think of a lot of things that have done that. It's pretty cool. And, talking about in the mid 80s. So something that was maybe a little bit ahead of its time.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. I think, like you said, there's a lot of people coming back to this one after discovering him through the road, like I did, or others, and kind of getting back into the back catalog and really appreciating this and thinking that this is his best book. And I highly recommend people reading it. I think it's a really challenging book to read. Again, not from the subject matter. I'm not put off by that kind of stuff at all. It is what it is. I'm more, it's like a book I'll maybe pick up again in a few years and try to just read again and probably get a lot more out of it. Cause it's difficult. Like I feel like I'm a good reader. And I think that I'm, able to follow along most of the ways. So it was kind of interesting to be challenged by something like that. Like I haven't been challenged by a book like that since college literature classes or something where.
Yeah.
where
I agree.
I don't know what the fuck is going on here. So yeah,
I wonder if they're reading this in high school.
I don't know. I don't think so. High school.
I feel like it would take a while for that to build ahead of steam. It's interesting too. Like,
I'm barely sophisticated enough for this now. I don't think I'd be sophisticated enough for this when I was 16.
I think, so this is the type of book that I want my kids to read because I want them to appreciate good writing. But I do wonder how many people come to this because of that sensationalist thing of, you got to check out the brutality and the death and the violence and the graphical depictions of people getting scalped and babies getting murdered. And the book has all that, but I don't think that's not the power of the novel. I like the fact that people are going to come for that and find something that's so beautifully written, because I don't think you would expect those two things to coexist on the page. But yeah, and I don't even know how to articulate that, but the fact that it has all that, I hope that people are reading it for the right reasons, and that's just to behold a master craftsman, a master writer at the top of his game.
Definitely. Yeah,
it's so interesting. And the fact that it comes in the middle of his body of work. It's only $10 book too. Of 12, so he had he already had a head of steam, and he has a long way to go after this book until his last year.
Yeah,
2022.
They have in the back here. I'm looking. They have after the epilogue, they have all the pretty horses, the crossing, cities of the plain, the road, obviously No Country for Old Men, and then also available Child of God, the Counselor, the Orchard Keeper, Outer Dark, the Stonemason, the Sunset Limited, and like you said, Suttree. I'm interested to go back into some of these. It's cool. I love authors like this that I think it's actually fairly typical. I think there's only a few authors that stand out from this where it's like 10 or 12 books, 6 books, 8 books. It's cool. Like you can wrap your arms around it in a way that makes sense. And I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's important to say, Kyle, I should have said this earlier. James Franco had the rights to develop this.
Oh yeah. I read that
for a while.
Yeah.
He did a proof of concept that I think you could still find on YouTube. Just some shots. I don't think it's not mastered. There's no graphic sort of embellishments. I don't think it's even in high def. I'm not even sure it's matched with the sound. I don't love his casting for it, but I think the proof of concept is basically them meeting the judge in the desert and them whipping up the homemade gunpowder. Luke Perry's in it. A couple other actors you would recognize. I'm not even sure what part Luke Perry
died, didn't he, Luke Perry?
I think he passed right after they shot this.
Oh, interesting.
Might have been the last thing he did, actually. That's interesting. But now John Hillcoat is signed on to direct, who directed The Road.
Nice.
And it's sad that we lost Cormac McCarthy because he and his son were supervising / I think handling the screenplay and some sort of advisement capacity. So I wonder if the film will be shelved or at least delayed because of that. But I am worried. Yeah. I don't know. Now that you've read the book, how do you feel? And it's also gone through Ridley Scott. Ridley Scott tried to take a crack at it. He kind of backed out, figured that it wasn't gonna work for the screen. Now, having read it, Kyle, how do you feel about the chances of successfully adapting this to the screen somehow?
Yeah, I don't like the idea, but I think maybe like a mini series would be more compelling. Yeah. I think you got to spend a little more time with the book than just 90 minutes or 120 minutes or something. I just don't know how you would.
I agree.
I don't know how you would do it. So maybe you could do 3 90-minute episodes or 4 90-minute episodes, something like that. Like 5 hours. I think if you can get that, I think if you can go 5 or 6 hours, I think you can make it happen. But
yeah, I think that would be really cool. And that model just seems to work. That would work for today, Yeah, I don't know what the hesitance is there, which maybe. And
then they can delete it for tax purposes and we'll never see it again.
Get it while it's hot.
But I think that out of the ones so The Road, I think, is a very easy movie to adapt. And I think they did a really nice job of adapting it. No Country for Old Men, I read it first and then I watched the movie and I thought the adaptation was very well done.
Super good.
The book is better, of course. I just, in reading, because I was cognizant that they were never able to do a movie about this. And I'm like, I can see that. This is a challenging, it's reflected in the writing itself. I was actually thinking as I was writing, like if you're a screenwriter and you're going through this and kind of penning through it and gleaming notes or whatever, like what are the scenes that you would even take out of this? You can't do all of it, So, and like the little things that matter, people looking at each other and things happening in the backgrounds and all that. I was thinking about that through the eyes of the filmmaker. Not that I know anything about it. And I think it would be a very difficult task, so it's not a surprise that it's gone through. I mean, Ridley Scott is obviously a genius. James Franco, very well respected mover and shaker in multiple avenues of Hollywood. So now, we'll see if they can get this thing off the ground now. I think that there's promise. I just think you got to have the right person doing it. And it's kind of a horror movie, it would kind of be, I
think so. I think it's quite horrific. And it doesn't, like you said, it doesn't have that very structured, firm plot line. It meanders. It's a little more, it takes strange arcs. It's not really about the story. It's more about the setting and the characters and just the tone of it, the spirit of it. And that's something it's an art piece. It really is. It works as a novel, but making that work in visual form is a whole different ball of wax.
There's going to be a question about taste.
Yeah.
Because obviously there's objectively horrible violence in shows like Game of Thrones really took it to the next level, but I don't think there's anything quite like some of the things you see here. Violence against animals, violence against children, little girls. I just don't know how, and if you can't, and you don't want to show obviously some of that stuff, but if you can't, then you can't really portray the evil of the story.
Yeah.
So you might as well, like, how do you, for instance, like the thread of the rape of little girls throughout and murder of little girls throughout the story where the judge is, but they never really say it. How would you portray that?
Yeah.
How would you portray them taking babies by like their ankles and smashing them against rocks? How do you portray them throwing dogs off of cliffs? How do you portray them walking up to horses and goats and shooting them in the head? How do you I don't know.
It's upsetting stuff.
So I just think that some things are not meant to be on the screen, or that like if you were to reflect it accurately, you'd have like a fucking snuff film basically,
yeah. I mean, it basically does amount to that.
So I don't know, man. I don't know that you I can see that would be a challenge. I think that there's like a challenge. If I were even not a publisher, because we're talking about movies, but like a film studio or like like Sony or whatever, I'd be really wary about the violence, because I just don't think you can do it without it. I just don't know how you do. You can, I guess, have them lift the baby in the air and then cut away.
Right.
But
it becomes something else then.
That's still mega violent though. And you could have him take the dogs and just throw them like his back so you don't see it or whatever. I guess you can do those things, but it's all just the insinuation of that kind of violence is well above and beyond what most people ever experience in their fiction.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. It's the idea of it. It's not showing it graphically. It's the idea of alluding to these things on screen.
Indeed.
Indeed. And they would have to do it that way, but it would still, I feel like maybe it's interesting thinking like somebody purposely writing something that would be impossible to adapt to any other medium, any other format.
Yeah. I wonder where his head was at. Cause I know, like you said, he did screenwriting and I think ghostwriting in some of like that space or screen doctoring.
Yeah.
And then, but this was before he was famous. So I don't know if he had his mind towards like writing things first. Like I think The Road was even optioned before the book came out. Like that was kind of like easy, I think, for them to digest. Really, really well done movie. But
yeah, it is.
I don't know if he had the mind for that back then. I wouldn't know. I don't really know much about him.
You want to make money at something. I heard some anecdote. I don't know if it's true, but I heard before he kind of blew up and got his Genius Grant and all that kind of stuff, MacArthur Grant, that Blood Meridian had made over years like a profit of like $900 or something. Like it was barely in the black. Like it really wasn't in the black.
Interesting.
Which is really interesting to know that there's a revisionist history with McCarthy. People really didn't recognize this guy. Which is interesting of what you said of Random House publishing this book, because somebody or some bodies were taking a chance on him back then. Recognized that talent, the writing ability, something special was going on there. And then, before Oprah did the famous interview and put him on and all. Oprah.
I'm Richie Cunningham.
And this is my wife, Oprah.
All right. I think that's all we have for the Blood Meridian. Yes, or Blood Meridian. I keep calling it it's Blood Meridian. Blood Meridian or The Evening Redness in the West. Like I said, I bought it on Amazon for $10. And this copy was just published a few weeks ago. It's weird.
It's good stuff, my friends.
Yeah. So check it out if you'd like, or rent it at your local library. Listen to it on I don't listen to books. Maybe I should do that. I have no context for listening to a book on tape or whatever.
It could be hard because it's got to be the right narrator. I find it very frustrating. The two people that do the audiobooks for Cormac's latest two books, his last two books, The Passenger and Stella Maris, I can't listen to them. They're not the right voices. So I would recommend reading those. But Richard Poe reads, there might be two different versions, but Richard Poe does one of the versions of Blood Meridian. It's friggin' astounding. I mean, it's that good, dude. So good. So if you're too lazy to pick up the book,
or if you're illiterate like the kid, cue it up. I'm by the way, this is apropos of nothing, but I'm continuously, speaking of reading, I'm always surprised like how illiterate the upcoming generations are. Do you read these statistics sometimes where it's like,
you were talking about this recently? I always wonder about this because all they do is text.
Exactly. You would think that they would be the most, like, they would be reading very early. But they're not. They don't know how to read.
That's ridiculous.
Imagine giving this book to, that's what I was saying, like giving this book to someone in Belport High School. Are you kidding me? There's probably like 10 people in that entire school that could even read this book, and they were probably, half them were teachers. But
maybe that's the point of entry, is that you really have to appreciate that special flavor of writing. I don't know what that flavor is, but something uniquely different, and I think visionary. If you appreciate that, you got to read this book.
Yeah, check it out.
Even if you could just weigh in on the argument, you're going to come in on the side of this is the best book ever written, or you're going to come in on the side of this is dreck, or
at least you'll know,
mediocre at best. You know?
It took me probably, I don't know, 8 hours, something like that to read. 10 hours.
That's not bad.
Something like that.
That's not bad at all.
And I reread some parts of it because I was like, I don't really know what I think everyone reads and then you're like, I have no idea what the fuck I just read. And then you have to read the page again. That happens all the time. But it was like actual, like, I don't understand what you're saying. I got to go back again. It wasn't me just like zoning out.
And I don't want to be a hype beast for things, but I feel like this book, now you're in on the conversation. How can you really talk about books if you never read this book? A lot of people consider this the greatest book written.
I agree.
So
I gotta read more fiction. I gotta read more fiction.
Me too. Oh, I'm really guilty of not reading enough fiction anymore.
Me too. I really dedicated. I was really into fiction when I was a kid. I got really into nonfiction in high school, and then I only read nonfiction in college, and then I just continued to read nonfiction in my adult life. I always felt like it was like, I want to get something out of this, so I want to like spend my time wisely. But really,
I get that
fiction is where it's at. I mean, and I'm very familiar with some of the bibliographies of some of the various great writers, but not really. I mean, there's a lot of classics I haven't read. A lot of Russian shit I haven't read, especially like the like mid to late 19th century, early 20th century Russian writing. Like, I don't know very much about that. That's some of the most important fiction ever written. So like, there's just whole entire, like, what is that one book, The Brothers Asmanov or whatever? Like, that's supposed to be like a must read. I never read that. Like, there's just certain things. So I got a lot of reading to do myself, and I think I'm going to get more into this fiction as I go, because like you brought up Sound and Fury before, Faulkner. I think that was one of his first books, actually. But I haven't read that much Faulkner. Like, we brought up Moby Dick, which I love Moby Dick, but I never read anything else. So I don't know. I just think it's so interesting to think about all the various things that we, like, all the options you have for entertainment, and how it's really
aggravating.
Yes, it is aggravating. It is aggravating. There's
not enough time in the day. You know what I mean? So many gaps.
Right. Because it's like, I bring up Moby Dick and Melville. It's like, I have no time to even think about, I want to reread Moby Dick. And it's like, I don't even have time to think about that.
You hear that.
But, all right, Dave, let's wrap up. Seems inappropriate today, but let's end with a dad joke.
Okay. We'll go out with some levity. Why not?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Oh, wait, that's a cute one, but all right, let's stick with this one. Kyle, what did the baker say when she won an award?
I don't know.
It was a piece of cake.
Very well done.
I like that it's a she.
Yeah. Why not?
Why not?
Why don't you get a they in there one day?
Well, maybe they will. Maybe they're in here.
All right, my friend. That was fun. Blood Meridian, or The Evening Redness in the West, Cormac McCarthy, 1985 novel. Go check it out. Maybe we'll return to the show in the coming years if there's a movie, and we can go into that as well.
That would be fun. Or a miniseries.
Yeah, miniseries would be nice. HBO, like 4 episodes, 90 minutes. I think you can do it.
Or a video game.
Or a video game. NC-17, no doubt about it. Smashing babies against Rock Simulator.
Oh, no.
Shake the Wiimote to smash the baby against the rocks.
Oh, no. Take the baby thing out, and I think 50% of the gratuitous violence, right? Like, that's so bad. That specific thing is so bad. Sorry to spoil it for you guys. Take that out.
Are you kidding me? They're 2.5 hours into the thing. You're sorry to spoil it?
And we've referred to it.
What are you talking about?
Times.
All right, let's get the hell out of here. It's time to go. Thank you all for your kindness out there. And the generosity you show towards Last Stand, KnockBack, all of our shows. We appreciate it. We couldn't do without you. Patreon.com/LastStandMedia for early ad-free access. LastStandMedia.store for merch. More new merch coming soon. See you next time. Until then, goodbye. KnockBack, a retro and nostalgia podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Collins Last Stand LLC, and is recorded from Central Virginia and the Philadelphia suburbs, USA. The show was conceived by and is produced by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-host is Dagan Moriarty. KnockBack's executive producer is Dustin Furman, and the show is edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand Media's shows, including KnockBack, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/LastStandMedia. The following names are at the producer support level or higher on Patreon, and we're grateful for your kindness and generosity.